Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a nice idea if you can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was driving home from the night shift, the kind of drive that makes your brain quieter than normal. It was late, maybe around 11, and the road up to my cabin wound through a chunk of mountain with no houses and no lights. I was the only car for a long stretch. My headlights cut a tunnel through the trees, and anything beyond that tunnel was black. A few miles before my turnoff, I saw something off to the right, above the tree line. I pulled over because I couldn't tell what it was. 3 lights, bright and steady, not blinking like a plane, not moving like a helicopter. They hovered there, in a patch of sky, almost level with each other. I killed my headlights for a second to see them better, and the lights seemed to drag a little brighter, like they were the only things in the sky that mattered. When I rolled down my window, there was no sound. No hum, no engine, nothing. Just the wind in the trees and my car. I sat with the hazards on for maybe 10 minutes. I thought about driving closer, but the road narrowed, and if something was wrong, I didn't want to get stuck. I called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff and told them what I saw. The woman on the phone typed and told me someone would look into it. She sounded tired, like most people in that job do at night. That made me feel better for a minute, like whatever it was might be checked off and handled. The next morning, a coworker joked about UFOs when I said I'd seen lights. He laughed and then went back to his coffee. Small things happened after that made me feel off. My porch light had been knocked loose and hung by its wires. A rock I kept by the door was moved to the other side of the step. My dog, my neighbor's dog, really, since mine stayed with my sister, kept staring at the woods and wouldn't come inside when I called. I thought I was just tired, or jumpy from working alone nights. That week I started getting weird calls. No number, just silence when I picked up. Once a call showed up as 000000000. When I answered, there was someone breathing very softly, and then the line clicked dead. My phone battery started acting up too. It would drop from 40% to 10 in a few minutes, then climb back up after I restarted it. I blamed the old battery at first, but it made the whole experience feel like a sandbox of little problems piling up. On the 4th night after the lights, I got home around midnight. It had been raining in the afternoon, so the dirt road to my cabin was thick with mud. I parked, turned the engine off, and in the small circle of light my taillights made, I saw fresh tire marks cutting around the yard. Not a simple pass, more like someone had driven in a slow circle near the cabin, tires churning the mud. I didn't see a car. There were no new footprints in the soft ground up to the porch. I chalked it up to a truck passing earlier and not thinking about it. But when I unlocked the door, I felt watched in a way that 2 beers and bad TV couldn't fix. That night the wind made this low, weird moan through the eaves. I kept waking up to check the front window and didn't know why. Once, around 3 in the morning, I saw a dark shape on the road through the gap of trees. It sat under the moonlight, still. I told myself it was a deer or a pile of trash. I watched until it moved, and it never did. Morning came anyway. After the 2nd week, I called the sheriff again. I explained the lights, the calls, the tracks. They said they put a deputy on a patrol route. The deputy stopped by one afternoon and walked around the property, looked at the porch light, took a picture of the ground. He asked me a lot of practical questions and wrote them down. He didn't say he'd found anything unusual. He told me to call if anything else happened. 2 nights after that, something happened that got me up at 2 in the morning. I'd fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on low and the window cracked because it was warm. I woke when I heard a noise against the front door. It was a heavy, measured knock, like someone pounding with the heel of a hand. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the kind of knock that wanted the door opened right now. I looked at the clock on the microwave, 2:09 a.m. My heart did a thing I could feel in my throat. I went to the peephole and looked out. 2 men were standing on my porch. They were dressed exactly the same: black suit, black tie, black hat. The hats had wide brims and made their faces hard to see. They both had the same kind of coat, the same kind of briefcase. Their shoes were caked with mud, and the mud looked like the same mud in my yard. They stood a little too straight, shoulders back, hands empty. "Open up," the nearest one said. His voice was flat and even, like someone reading from a script. I didn't open the door. I clicked the deadbolt and put the chain on, and the chain made a small, useless sound that made them knock harder. "We just need to ask a few questions," the other man said. "Officer questions. It'll be quick." They sounded like officers, but they didn't say which agency. They didn't show badges. They didn't identify themselves beyond that line. When I told them I wasn't opening the door, they started talking to me as if we were already on a phone call. "You reported lights over the county last Thursday night," the one directly at the door said. He sounded very calm. "We were checking leads." I said, "I called the non-emergency line." "That's it. We called you back." The man on the left named my workplace. He knew where I clocked in, the name of my supervisor, the exact schedule I worked. I hadn't told anyone that information except a few people at work and my sister. Then he said my sister's name and the street she lived on. I had only told a handful of people where she lived, and only once on the phone when we were figuring out a babysitting thing. My stomach flipped over. "Why do you know that?" I asked. The one at the door smiled the tiniest fraction. "We were gathering information." "Who are you?" I asked. He tilted his head as if thinking of the easiest answer. "We're investigators." They kept asking me to open the door. When I said no, the one directly at the door started describing other things about me. He said how much was in my checking account. He named the exact balance down to the cents. I had only told my sister that number a few days earlier because I needed her to cover something and she'd asked. I had never told anyone else, not even my coworkers. The man said it like he was reading from my bank statement. "You don't have to open," he said. "We can talk through the door." That was a lie. They kept talking through the door, and it just made the air feel thicker. They described little details about my cabin where I kept my spare key. I didn't, but they said someone had checked under the planter by the steps, what brand of cereal I bought, something stupidly specific, the color of the towel on the bathroom rack. Every small, private thing they named felt like a person opening envelopes that weren't theirs. I called 911 with the phone on speaker and put it down on the counter. The woman on the line asked for my address and asked if I was safe. I whispered that 2 men were at my door. "Do not open the door," she said. "Stay where you are. Units are on the way." She told me to lock all the doors. She told me someone would be there as soon as they could. The knocks kept coming while I sat there listening to the operator's calm voice on my kitchen counter and the men outside trading phrases like polite robbers. "You shouldn't have reported us," the one at the door said, as if it explained everything. I heard one of them move away from the door, and then he was at the back of the house. The window over the sink rattled with the sound of his footsteps. I froze because if I moved I would make a sound and then maybe he would come in. The second man started listing off more details. My sister's kids' nicknames. The brand of shoes I wore to work. The exact amount in my wallet. He knew that I had sent a text to my ex at 1:02 a.m. the week before. He named the time. A car engine started somewhere outside, and then stopped. I couldn't tell if it was his car coming and going or someone else. My phone buzzed in my pocket, one of those unknown numbers again. I ignored it. I pressed my back against the wall and kept my eyes on the peephole. The men stayed, moving in slow, small circles on my porch, like they were marking territory. After a while, maybe 20 minutes, the one nearest the door started talking about the lights. "You saw them," he said. "That was interesting. What was it?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. He said, "Things happen. We have to catalog." His voice sounded like it was trying not to mean anything. When a deputy finally showed up, lights flashing blue and white and the siren low and drawn out, both men were gone. The deputy parked down the road and walked up with his flashlight. He said he'd seen tire tracks in the mud and footprints that led to the road, but nothing else. He radioed dispatch and they came back saying surveillance feeds in town showed no matching cars. They checked my camera's motion sensor, one by the garage and the porch camera, and the footage froze for a 5-minute span right before the men showed up. The deputy frowned at the camera and said that was odd. He wrote notes and told me he'd file a report and pass along the description of the men. He didn't say he believed me. He didn't need to. He offered to stay until dawn, but he had to go follow another call. I didn't sleep. The knocks had a way of making the whole house feel like a mouth. I sat on the couch and watched the fog circle on the window where they'd stood. I could see the impression of their boots in the mud from the porch light. The dirt looked like it had been turned in a circle more than once. By morning it was raining again and the yard was a mess of churned mud. I went out under the light and walked around the cabin. The tire tracks were there, and they made this weird ring around the house. Whoever had driven had gone slow and close, a continuous circle, like they tried to put the cabin in the center of a loop and then left. There were no car parts, no footprints getting to the porch. The mud had been pressed by tires that matched over and over. You could follow the circle all the way around. I walked a whole lap and felt stupid doing it, but it was there. I called my sister and told her to get her kids out of her house. She asked 100 questions and I could hear the panic in her voice. She told me to go to her place or to town. I called my boss and told him I was taking a leave. I packed a bag, grabbed my wallet, and left. I drove down that road and didn't look in the rear view except once when the sunrise made a pale strip of light across the trees. There was nothing on the shoulder, nothing in the ditches. The circle in my yard was the clearest thing left behind. At the gas station in town I went in and tried to be normal, paid cash for a coffee, lit a cigarette, told myself that I'd move the spare key and change my locks and all that. But the feeling of being watched stuck to me in a slow, sticky way. I watched everybody, and nobody watched me back. I stayed with my sister for a few nights. I changed banks. I canceled cards. I told my landlord I needed to break the lease. He didn't argue much, said the paperwork would be fine. He asked if I was okay and I said a word that covered up the whole thing. The sheriff called a few days later. They checked the county perimeter cameras and petty traffic cams. Nothing. The footage from my house was missing the 5 minutes. My neighbor said he hadn't seen any cars at night. Someone had driven around my cabin and left a circle in the mud, but there was no car to match. It was like the tracks had been made by something that didn't want to be seen. I sold most of my stuff and moved into a small apartment in town. I changed my phone number, my email addresses, and I stopped talking about what happened with many people. I told the story to the sheriff, who put it on file and then didn't call back for anything big. My sister moved her kids to a different school district for a while until she felt better. Even months later I would open my phone and see an unknown number pop up and my hands would get cold. Once I looked at my bank balance at work and the number seemed too exposed, like a thing that someone who knew it might use to prove they could reach in. I had someone check my credit report and my accounts. Nothing else turned up. No identity theft, no forced access. Just those 2 men in suits with their perfect, slow voices reciting what they shouldn't have known. A year after I left the cabin, I went back once to pick up the last box of things I'd left in storage there. The yard still looked the same in a certain way, lonely, a place that had been put on hold. The porch light swung once in the wind and then steadied. There were no fresh tracks. I walked all the way around the house and saw faint marks where the mud had been churned months before. The ring had flattened with time, but the circle was still there in the ground like a scar. I locked the door behind me for the last time and drove away. I didn't look back again. I was driving the long way home because I couldn't sleep and thought the highway would make my head quiet. It was slow, aimless driving, gas station coffee, old playlist on repeat, the kind of night where everyone else is already inside somewhere. I left the city after midnight and took the 2-lane that runs out past the industrial parks and then into empty highway with nothing but signs and distant hills. Halfway through I saw something in the sky that I couldn't explain. It was over a white patch of dark, the kind of sky that ate light. There were 3 lights in a row, not blinking, just steady, white and raw. They weren't the soft glow of planes or the flash of a meteor. They hung like someone left 3 lamps up there. I pulled onto the shoulder and turned my car off to listen. There was nothing, no engine sound, no wind heavier than normal. It felt like the sky had been cut open and someone put little candles in it. I called the station on the non-emergency line because I didn't know what else to do. The woman on the phone asked where I was, wrote it down, and said they'd have a cruiser check the area if there were other calls. She sounded bored and tired, and that was fine. I told my sister about it when I stopped for coffee and she joked, but the joke didn't make me laugh. I got back on the road and kept half expecting to see them again. I didn't. I ended up at a roadside motel because it was late and I didn't want to drive the rest of the way home tired. The place was one of those stucco jobs with a single long parking lot and an office that smelled like old bleach and too much incense. The girl at the desk took my card without looking up. The TV in the lobby played a muted news channel I couldn't name, and there were 2 men in dark suits sitting on the couch. They weren't talking. They weren't doing anything except sitting and facing the front windows. I didn't think about them at first. I was tired and I needed the room and didn't want to make a big deal of anything. The men looked normal in a way that made me notice them more. Suits that fit, shoes that were clean even though the parking lot was wet from an earlier drizzle. Their jackets were buttoned. One kept his hands on his knees, the other had his fingers threaded together like he was thinking. The hems of their trousers hit their shoes the same way. They didn't look at me when I signed the card. The girl at the desk handed me my key and the receipt without any small talk, and when I left they remained there, 2 silhouettes in the blue light from the lobby window. The room smelled like someone had tried to scrub the last guest off it. The lamp next to the bed hummed when I turned it on. I left the TV low and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, watching the highway lights beyond the motel's parking lot. Everything was ordinary. The placard that told you checkout time was 11 a.m., the pen chained to the desk by the phone, the laminated card listing emergency numbers. Ordinary things were the reason I felt bad the next morning about how tense I'd been. It was easy to tell myself I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But a few small things happened that night, and none of them were big enough to be proof, but were big enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. First, my phone buzzed twice with a call from no caller ID. The first time I ignored it, the second time I answered, and there was nothing other than a faint, rhythmical breathing that stopped when I said hello. I hung up and texted my sister because that felt like doing something. She texted back a smiley face and told me to be careful. Her messages made me feel like it was nothing, but I kept rechecking the peephole in the door. The second small thing was that the desk pad by the phone had been turned over. That pad is the sort of thing housekeeping flips when they want to pretend the room is fresh. The pen was still attached, but the chain had a kink in it like someone had pulled it. I told myself later that the last guest must have been messy. The third thing was that the HVAC clicked and cycled oddly, like it tried to start and then gave up. That sound made the whole room feel colder than the thermostat said it should be. I brushed it off when I saw the two men again in the lobby in the morning. They were sitting in the same chairs, same posture, like they'd been waiting a long time. One of them smoked a cigarette in a way that looked deliberate and odd inside the motel lobby, like it was their home. The girl at the desk barely glanced up. I left before they said anything to me. The day after I checked and I drove to run a few errands into the small grocery where I got a sub for lunch. I felt watched the whole time, small and prickly like bug bites. People who'd normally be strangers in a small town looked briefly at me and then looked away. The man stacking cans in the back looked at me, then at my car in the lot, then at the sky. He shrugged when I asked if he'd seen anything strange the night before. He told me there had been talk at the hardware store about lights people saw on the hill that night, and someone mentioned how the sheriff's phone had lit up. That was the kind of small, true detail that fed the feeling that something was being said about me in rooms I wasn't in. The real unsettling things were small and patient. My coffee cup in the morning had been pushed to the far edge of the table, even though I always set it closer to the chair when I left. The curtain over the window had a crease like someone had straightened it. I heard the front door of the motel open twice and close softly at odd hours, although the neon vacancy sign clicked off during the day. My car felt like it had been inspected when I got into my glove compartment was closed, even though I always left it slightly ajar, and the spare tire cover in the trunk had shifted the tiniest bit. I told myself this was paranoia. I locked the doors and laughed at the laugh in my throat. The second night, after a long dinner with my sister on the phone where we argued about nothing real, I came back to the motel and saw the two men again in the lobby through the window. They were standing now, and one of them was talking to the desk clerk. It didn't look like a normal conversation because the clerk's smile was gone and she kept glancing toward the door where the highway light showed as a stripe. When I walked in, the men didn't move to let me by. Their faces were even more neutral, blank as old coins. I paid for another night and the clerk slid me the key without a word. As I turned to go, the man nearest the reception desk said, without breaking his barely smile, "Safe travels." It sounded polite and wrong. No real man says something like that without meaning it. I heard it like someone inside my chest repeating something about doors. That night was worse in ways that were slow. I heard footsteps outside my door around 1 in the morning. Not the light padding of a motel guest, but a heavier, deliberate pace. The sound stopped outside my door and I froze with my hand on the doorknob, counting the seconds. I slid to the floor and crawled to the door, peephole at eye level, and looked out. There were two men in black suits standing right outside my door. No hats this time, no sunglasses, just black suits and black coats, their faces plain and ordinary in a way that made them worse. One of them was slightly older, the other younger. They stood there, not moving, not doing anything that belonged to people who should be at a motel. Their hands were empty. They were looking at the hallway like people looking at one thing too long turns their faces flat. I opened the door a fraction and asked, "Can I help you?" They both looked at me like they were seeing a version of me that they already knew. "We're investigators," the older one said. His voice didn't fit the hallway. It had no echo, very even, like a recorded voice. "We just have some questions about the lights." I hadn't told anyone in person about the lights except the clerk and my sister. I said I already told the sheriff's office on the phone and that I didn't want to talk. The younger man smiled almost politely. "It'll be quick. Nothing to worry about." I told him no and shut the door. I deadbolted and slid the chain on. The chain steadied the whole thing with a thin, ridiculous sound like hope. I called dispatch from the room phone because my cell service in the parking lot could be spotty. The woman at dispatch said a cruiser was on its way. Her voice made me feel like a child. She asked if the men were still there and I said yes, two men, suits, no badges, just standing. She said stay inside and the deputy would be there as soon as possible. The men knocked once, then again. Not a hard knock, but a slow, measured one that said they expected an answer even if they already knew it. After a while they stopped knocking and just stood with their shoulders touching the light from the exit sign. For a long time nothing happened and I listened to the sound of the fridge and the faint highway and my own heartbeat. I felt stupid for being so alert. I pretended I was exhausted and a silly person scared of her shadow. When the deputy arrived, he walked up in his shoes that made soft, practical sounds. The men were gone. The deputy parked under the sodium lamps and said he'd drive around and check. He asked me to check my lock and the peephole for scratches. I did. The peephole had small scuffs around the rim like someone had used a key to press against it and turned. The deadbolt had hairline scratches along the metal. It looked like someone had tried to force it but given up. At the front desk, the clerk pretended she didn't notice the men. She said they were part of a group of traveling reps who often stayed in the area and liked to keep to themselves. Her voice was too cheerful and she avoided looking at my face. The deputy jotted things down. He said he'd call the area units and see if there had been similar reports. He looked tired. He told me he'd stake out the property for a while. I believed him when he said he would, but experience had taught me to keep a part of my worry to myself. I didn't want to be the woman who cried wolf. The next morning, the lock on my door had more damage. The deadbolt was scratched deeper, the paint around it scraped like metal dragged across metal. The manager told me he'd replace it and apologized in the way people do when they don't know how to fix the feeling behind what happened. The pad by the phone, the same one I'd flipped to use for uncomfortable scrap paper, had a single line written on it in blocky, even letters, "Stop talking." My hand shook so hard reading it that the pen I used left a smear. I took a photo and sent it to my sister and the sheriff. The sheriff's office said they'd log it. The hotel manager said he'd keep a copy and put it in the report book. The woman at dispatch said they'd increase patrols and someone would come by more. The deputy on duty explained that sometimes people left notes as a prank, or someone with a grudge, or a drunk. He used all the words that fit into a place where nothing had been solved. I left right then. I packed the rest of my things into the car, left a key on the counter, and did not go back into that room. The men in black were not there when I checked out. The clerk's smile was back at the desk. She asked if everything had been okay and I lied and said fine, thank you. I drove off without glancing in the rearview mirror at the motel. The highway was quiet and the day was gray and nothing at all happened for the next 20 minutes and then I saw the men. They were in the diner window at the next exit, 2 suits at a corner table, coffee and mugs that matched. They were facing the road but not looking at me when I pulled into the parking lot to pee and fill the tank. The younger one was the kind of man who looked younger than he was. His hair was close-cut and neat. The other looked like he had practiced neutral expressions in a mirror. The diner felt loud and mundane and horrible because of them. People ate pancakes and read papers and the waitress wiped a counter and everything in the room went on like a stage during a play and we all pretended it was normal. I parked farther down and walked in like I belonged somewhere else. A woman behind the counter asked if I wanted coffee and the men in suits were the only things I could see. I drank my coffee too fast and left some dollars on the table without looking at the bill. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself to stop being ridiculous. Then I started driving and didn't stop until I reached my sister's house. My sister made me sit and told me to breathe and then told me to call the station and make an official report. The deputy who took the report was patient in the way people are with frightened strangers. His questions were the kind that marked him as someone who had seen a lot of small human disasters. He said he put out a bolo, be on the lookout, and that if I saw the men again to call right away. He said he'd pass the note to detectives. His voice was reassuring in a blunt, workmanlike way. After that, I stayed with my sister for a week. I canceled the reservations on my next trip. I changed my route when I had to go back to the city for work, and I avoided the stretch of highway near the motel. I went back to my regular life in ways that I could. I went into work and did my job and sat at my desk and typed emails. The note on the pad in the motel seemed stupidly small and huge at the same time, like someone had taken a pair of hands and rubbed a smear in the center of my world. A month later, a detective called and said they found two men who matched the description in a neighboring county. He asked me if I could identify them in a photo. They were side view pictures and a little grainy, but their posture and the way one of them held his hands matched what I remembered. I told him to bring the photos that night. When they came to the house, the detective laid them on the table and I stared until my eyes watered. I could not, in honesty, say it was them. They looked so like the men that had been in my mind for weeks that I wanted to grab the paper and shake the answer out of it. But I couldn't sign or say, "That's them." The detective nodded anyway, grave and careful. He told me they'd questioned the two men and they denied being at the motel. CCTV from other spots was inconclusive. They had no charge to hold them on and the system turned them loose. After that, the small things kept happening. A voicemail with 3 long breaths and then silence. A package on my porch that had only a magnet and no note. Once, a car followed me out of the grocery store and then eased into traffic like it had never been behind me at all. I started driving with a friend in the passenger seat whenever I could, and if I had to go alone, I kept the doors locked and the radio loud. I avoided motels for a long time, even chain ones. I changed my wallpaper. I changed my locks at home. I stopped posting about late-night drives. I didn't tell my coworkers what actually happened because it started to sound like I wanted attention and I didn't need that. My sister made me carry a small can of pepper spray that I kept in my purse like a superstition. It helped a little when I felt foolishly alone in the middle of a long aisle at the grocery store. I never saw those exact men again. I don't know if they ever watched me from a distance or if it was a handful of random, bad moments stitched together. I don't know if the note was meant to stop me from calling the sheriff or to stop me from telling people. I do know what was written in that blocky hand and what the lock looked like and where the scratch marks puckered the paint. Those details existed in a way that made me rearrange my life around them. I sold the car I took to the motel. I drove on different highways. After 6 months, the breath call stopped. The unknown numbers dried up. The package never came again. The world went back to being a lot of ordinary things happening to ordinary people, and I learned to let my nights get boring again. Once, years later, I drove by that stretch of highway because I had to, and the motel was boarded up. The sign leaned to one side. The grass in the parking lot had started to come up through the asphalt, and the place looked like a pause button everyone had forgotten to press. I kept my hands on the wheel and did not slow down. When I told myself I'd never go back, I believed it the way you believe small, useful promises. I survived it. I moved. I told the sheriff everything I could. I kept a copy of the photo of the pad with the words written on it saved in a folder on my computer I rarely opened. Sometimes when I wake at night, I check the locks twice and listen to the HVAC cycle. I sleep with the lamp off. None of that is proof of anything. It is just what I did after someone inked 3 words on a sheet of motel paper and left them where I could find them. I was driving home from a job that didn't really pay what it should and left me tired in a way coffee didn't fix. It was late, the kind of late where the highway narrows and the bars and restaurants have already shut their doors. I took the back road because it cut maybe 10 minutes off and because I liked the quiet, the way the trees pressed in and the radio sounded tinny and safe. The route had a stretch of county road that dove through farmland and then climbed into a patch of low hills. There weren't many houses out there, nothing that had lights on every window. Mostly it was dark or a single porch light or the blink of a barn. I noticed the headlights behind me about 10 minutes into that stretch. At first I didn't think anything of it. A lot of cars were out on weekends, and people passed slow drivers all the time. I glanced in the mirror and saw them. One car, two lights, a safe distance back. I moved over when there was room to let them pass, because that's how you drive country roads at night. They didn't pass. When the road narrowed and the shoulder got soft, I slowed to a crawl, hoping they'd go around. The lights stayed exactly where they were, right behind me, like someone had parked a pair of lamps on my bumper. I kept the speed low and flicked the blinkers, and eventually I pulled onto a little gravel turnout with room for one car and some brush. I killed the engine. For a minute the world shrank to the hiss of the dash and the low creak of my seatbelt. I expected the headlights to sweep past me and that would be that. Instead, the car stopped in line with me, maybe 10 feet back, and the engine sat at an idle pitch you could just hear if you rolled down the window. No one honked, no one shouted. The lights didn't blink. They just stayed there, steady and close. I sat for a few breaths and told myself not to be stupid. Maybe the driver was waiting for traffic ahead, for a deer to cross. Maybe it was a family pulled over for directions. I put the car in drive and eased out, showing my taillights as a way to signal movement. The other car matched my motion exactly. I turned onto the gravel again. They matched the turn. I gripped the wheel tighter. The road narrowed after that, down to a lane that barely fits two cars, and then it turned into a dirt road that led to a cluster of rental cabins some miles up. My map said there weren't any other exits for a long stretch. I flicked my lights to high and then back to low just to be annoying, to tell whoever it was to pass. The headlights behind me did the same, like a mirror. I pulled over to the side and stopped again, and this time I got out. I walked back with my phone in my hand and the flashlight on. The gravel crunched under my boots. The idling car sat where it had been. The driver's door didn't open. I shone the light through the rain-streaked glass. There were two figures inside. They were sitting perfectly still, like statues propped in the seats. Both wore dark suits. I couldn't make out faces because the moon was low and their heads were turned to the side, as if they were listening to something only they could hear. One had his hands flat on his knees, palms down, fingers spread. The other sat with his back straight against the seat, shoulders square, like he'd been drilled to hold that posture. They didn't move when I walked all the way around the car and shined the light in their faces. They didn't look at me. The interior was darker than you'd expect, like someone had put a shade inside. The radio was off. No breath fogged the glass. The engine hummed. I remember thinking it would be funny to knock on the window like a jackass and say something stupid. Instead, I felt something like a safer instinct shove the key into the ignition and get the hell out. When I climbed in, my hands didn't shake. I started the car and it felt like I was trying to restart a body that didn't want to move. At first I thought they might follow, that the car would pull out in a moment and tail me for however long it took me to get to the highway. I jammed the gas. They didn't follow. The lights in the mirror stayed where they were, steady, then faded as I went faster. The rest of that drive was a mess of thoughts. Part of me knew it was just two men in suits, maybe lost, maybe hired muscle of some sort, maybe students on a long night drive. Part of me felt stupid and a little silly. But another part, the part that stuck in my chest with a cold, flat pressure, kept rewinding the way their shoulders had been. It was their stillness that didn't belong, the way they sat as if time had been pinned to their backs. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line from the highway, telling myself that at least I was being logical. The woman on the other end took my report and asked me where I had been, and whether the car had followed me into town. Her voice was a little bored the way people's voices sound in late-night jobs. She asked the questions and typed. I described the car as best I could, dark color, two people inside, their posture. She told me they would send a cruiser to check the county road in the morning. If you see them again, call 911, she said, and that line held a kind of authority I wanted to believe. I pulled into the all-night diner a little later because my hands were still clenched around the steering wheel and coffee calmed me down. The place smelled like grease and orange cleaner. The waitress put a mug down in front of me without asking and smiled like she had placed a bowl of someone's quiet. I told her about the car and she nodded like she wasn't surprised. She said folks around here saw weird things sometimes, headlights on deserted roads, people squatting by the tree line, hunters out past midnight. She said nothing had been reported last night. The older couple at the other booth pretended to read their paper and then pretended some more. The world in the diner had a soft, slow rhythm that contrasted with how fast my thoughts were moving. After breakfast, I went to work. I kept glancing at the window, at the parking lot. My coworker kept asking if I had slept and I lied and said yes. I couldn't focus. I told the boss I had to leave early to run an errand and she asked what for and I said nothing. I picked up a 6-pack at the corner market like it was a tool, something to use if the night got long. I told myself not to be dramatic. That night I drove the same stretch again, because running errands had put me in the area and because I wanted to check that gravel turnout. The place was empty. The light from the highway overpass looked colder than it had before. The gravel was undisturbed, no new tire ruts. I checked the brush in the ditch where someone might have waited. I found a cigarette, but that wasn't mine. It was crushed but still warm to the touch. Someone had been sitting there, maybe not long before. That small, burned-in felt like a detail that wanted to be important. A few nights later I was on the road again and the headlights came up behind me like a bad habit. This time they followed me down a stretch of dirt road that fed to a dead-end farm. I took the farm road because I wanted to see what would happen. The road pinched between fields and the moon was half hidden behind a cloud. I slowed when the dirt started to collect in thin dust, and then I saw a sign for a cul-de-sac where a few cabins sat. The headlights tracked me all the way. I eased onto the shoulder and turned the car off and breathed like someone who'd been running and then stopped. The car in back pulled in behind me, and then for the first time since the night on the gravel I saw the driver's side window roll down a fraction. A sliver of light from the dashboard turned over their faces. The figures were the same, suits, stillness, posture like mannequins. One of them reached up and touched his collar like he was straightening invisible rope. The other sat with his chin slightly tilted, watching wherever someone invisible had told him to watch. I may have said something stupid then. I may have called out, "Hey," from across the road. The sound of my voice was small. The man nearest me didn't blink. His head turned, but not to look at me like a person would. It turned like a functional mechanism. He listened to the wind and the creak of fence posts and the distant hum of a tractor that wasn't running. I started my car and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, and then I put it on cruise and drove fast enough that the numbers on the speedometer felt like achievement. The lights in my mirror stayed put and then faded as I accelerated. The whole time I had this sense that if I made one mistake, slowed down too much, pulled into a driveway, the car would be there, close, and that two silhouettes would be watching me like they had always been watching this road. The police took my reports and filed them. They asked questions: what kind of car, license plate, anything unique. I couldn't say. Night bench shapes. I gave them the cigarette, but I had found it the turnout, and they said they'd tested for DNA, which made me feel important for a second and then less sure. The deputy who took the report said people with words like "men in black" would make jokes at the station, and sometimes a guy might show up in a cheap suit to intimidate someone who'd seen something he shouldn't. He told me not to worry, that if the men were staying in one car, the cameras on the bypass would have caught them by now. I kept having small things happen that eroded at me slowly. It started with the phone calls. At first they were missed calls with strange numbers that went to voicemail, and then a call that came through at 2 in the morning where all I heard was a radio hum and then a click. Once I picked up and there was a faint, static-laced voice that said my full name like it had been cleared a throat before speaking. It didn't say anything else. I put the phone on the table and watched it vibrate like a heartbeat. My neighbor, an older man who fed stray cats in his garage, said he had seen a dark car parked under the walnut tree behind the shed. He said he didn't think much of it until the car moved off without lights and left a circle of churned mud near his fence. He felt uncomfortable telling me, like he was telling me he had fed a raccoon in his kitchen. That evidence of someone circling a place where people lived, where lights came on and off, made the hairs along my arms rise. Then came the night in which I almost made the worst mistake of my life. I was driving home from a late shift and the headlights were behind me again. They kept their distance this time, a safe measure off the bumper. I thought about pulling into the 24-hour gas station and waiting, but I also didn't want to be seen waiting. I took the county road and then a shortcut through a line of houses and then a dirt lane that led to my apartment complex, old units with porches and lights that hummed over the walkways. I eased under the street lamp nearest my building and slowed to let the car behind pass. It didn't pass. I kept going into the parking lot and then up to my unit. I rolled down my window and thumbed my keys into my hand. When I stopped at my door, the car was just past the curb, engine idle, lights pointing directly at me. 2 men sat inside. The driver's door was closed. I fumbled with the keys, like someone already had a plan for me and I was making the wrong moves. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it like an engine that wouldn't catch. I thought if I kept my head down and moved fast I could get inside and lock the door and maybe they would leave. That's what I did, no theatrics, no bravery, just quick hands and quick feet. I snatched the deadbolt and threw the chain. I slammed my shoulder into the door like a man who wanted nothing to happen to him and I made it inside. I didn't look out the blinds. I sat on the couch with the lamp off and texted my sister and my neighbor and the number for the non-emergency line. I heard the muffled sounds of the outside, a radio turn on and then off, the soft thud of a car door, and then embedded in the quiet, a scraping sound, like someone had dragged a shoe along concrete, not walking but testing. My phone buzzed. An unknown number called and then clicked. After an hour the lights outside left. The next morning when I went to the car there was nothing but a card tucked under the windshield wiper. It was small, like a business card, but with no name. The card had thick stock. It didn't have a company name, just a black border and, in the middle, a single word printed in small type, notice. No phone, no address, no name. When I ran my finger over the letters they felt pressed into the paper, like someone had stamped them rather than printed them. I took the card to the sheriff. The deputy examined it and turned it in for fingerprint analysis and a simple chemical test. He told me to keep it like evidence but then to also keep it out of sight in case the person came back and wanted to be dramatic. That phrasing made me feel stupid, like the card was some kind of prank. The lab came back with nothing. No prints, no hair, no trace. The deputy frowned at that answer and said a lot of words that mean we'll keep an eye out, which in the back of my skull sounded like thin glass. The card became an object that changed my nights. I slept with it in the top drawer with my passport and the extra key. I don't know why. Maybe because if I kept it close I felt less like someone had been able to touch me and leave something small and strange. The nights after the card I made different choices. I didn't take the river road home. I called friends to come pick me up even if it was in the middle of the night. I asked my boss for different shifts that put me on the day schedule. All the small adjustments felt expensive, like a price I paid to buy back the right to go out after dark. Days bled into weeks. Most nights passed without a footnote. There were only a handful of times I saw a dark car that might have been them. Once I saw headlights at a distance that followed an exit sign on the highway, and I felt my lungs curl tight and my hands get slippery. I drove away from them, down a different on-ramp, and they kept going straight. Another time I saw a pair of heads in suits in the window of a motel and I turned away and kept going. Mostly what I had were memories, images stuck in my head of two men not moving and of a card with the single word notice pressed into it. After the card came other small, grinding things that made life into a series of twinges. I received a late-night voicemail that stopped at the moment my name was said. I found a mark on my mailbox where someone had reached in and felt for the box but then left. My neighbor said his surveillance camera recorded a dark car stopping under the street lamp for a minute and then driving off. The footage didn't show anyone getting out. It was like a negative space in which a person might have existed but didn't. Once, a month after that first card, I drove up to a convenience store in a strip mall to get an energy drink. It was late and the fluorescent lights hummed. I walked in and shuffled my money and felt eyes. Two men in suits were sitting at the far end of the diner-like counter, same as always, suits, stillness, posture. The waitress pretended she didn't know them. I bought a soda and left without taking it. The car followed me into the parking lot and then sat at the edge of the lot for a long time. I drove circles until it left and then drove home and sat in the car for a while, thinking maybe if I went inside the night would swallow me whole. I thought about moving. I thought about packing every cardboard box I owned and hauling them to my mother's house 2 states over. I scanned rental listings and thought, but in the end what I did was change my routine. I made different routes to work. I installed a camera over my porch that connected to my phone. I left a light on at night in the living room and turned it off when I heard something. I told myself I was being smart. The last time the car followed me closely was on a back road I used sometimes when I didn't want to see the highway. It was a rainy night and the road was slick, and the headlights were a soft smear in the rear view. I had the windows open just a crack because I liked the rain smell in the cabin. I pulled into a small diner and sat at a booth near the window. A man with tired eyes poured coffee into a thermos behind the counter. The two men in suits were at a table in the corner, not eating. The younger one folded his hands together and set them on the table in a way I had seen before. The older one watched the front window like someone watching an entrance. I ate a grilled cheese and didn't taste it. I fidgeted with my napkin. When I left the parking lot, the men in suits didn't get up. They stayed and watched the window. My car's heater still smelled like grilled cheese. I drove home slow and thought about courage, about the kind of person who goes back and faces whatever it is that scared them, like those men in suits must be able to, if they exist. I realized that courage wasn't the only answer. Sometimes the right move was the one that let you keep your life. Months went by with nothing, or with things so small that they could be explained away. But a sense I couldn't shake sat in me like a pebble in a shoe. At odd moments I'd see a black suit in a grainy crowd photo on the local news and the pebble would jab sharp. Once, on a highway billboard I drove past on a long trip, a man in a suit sold insurance and my stomach tightened like someone had flicked on a light. Eventually I started to forget how raw the fear had been. Memory reworks itself and smooths edges. The card became less an object and more a story I told to myself in the privacy of my head, how a small piece of paper had shown up like an invitation to pay attention. Some nights I'd wake up in the dark and check the camera footage from the porch and see nothing except a grain of streetlight and the occasional raccoon. I would breathe a slow breath and let the muscles unclench. I moved apartments after a year. I sold the car I had when the men followed me. I took a different job for a while and then another. I tried to go about my life. I stopped keeping the card in the top drawer and instead took it out and burned it in the sink once, watching the paper curl to ash and thinking it would close a door. The ash swirled down the drain and the water took it away. That felt clean for about a day. Years later, every now and then I would be driving and see a pair of headlights behind me and my fingers would tighten on the wheel. Sometimes the car would pass. Sometimes it would fade into the stretch of highway. Once, on a foggy evening, I saw two men in suits walking past a motel window as I waited at a light, and I felt that old chill. I turned left instead of right and went a different way home. The last real thing that happened was small and odd and, in a way, final. I was visiting my sister for her birthday. She lived 2 towns over and had a house with a porch and people around who would notice if something smelled wrong. We ate and laughed and drank cheap wine. I left late and drove back on unfamiliar roads because I wanted to see a different view of the night. The way home wound between farms and a strip of trees. A car pulled up behind me and kept pace for a while. I thought for a breath that maybe I had finally steeled myself for a confrontation, and maybe I would turn and speak to whomever was in the car and that would be the end of it. I didn't. I kept driving, and when the road straightened, the car passed without a glance. In the rearview mirror, their headlights blurred and then went away. Later that week I found another card somewhere, this time slid under a folded dollar in my change jar at home. The paper was thin and had no border. In tiny ink, the single word printed was different: watch. I threw it away. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell my sister. I bought a small safe and locked the passports and extra keys inside it, and made a list of new routes and memorized the names of friends who lived near plausible safe houses. I learned to file the fear somewhere I could carry it without letting it steer me. I never saw the faces of those men clearly. I never learned their names or why they sat so still inside a car with the engine on. I never answered whatever the card wanted me to stop doing or start doing. They became a shape in my life the way a scar is a map. You can look at it and know you had some story, but you can't always remember the exact hour the cut happened. In the end, the thing that saved me was small and practical: common sense, an instinct that wasn't brave but worked. I didn't get out of the car when they were there. I didn't go up to their window. I drove to places with lights and people and smiled like I belonged. I moved when it made sense and kept my friends close. I told the sheriff everything and kept copies of the reports. I didn't let curiosity push me into a tight place. Sometimes I pictured them sitting perfectly still in that dim interior, 2 men in suits who might have been waiting for something else entirely, or for nothing at all. That image would rise in me like a note of music that never resolves, and then I would do a concrete thing: call a friend, change a route, leave work a little earlier, and the note would fade. A couple of years after the first card, a journalist called me about a reader's rumor regarding a group that liked to show up at late-night scenes. I told the reporter the truth: what happened on the road, the card under the windshield, the nights of calls. He said it made sense, and then said it didn't. The next morning his paper printed a small column about persistence of rumor in small towns and how people sometimes dress the unknown in suits. The article used words like urban legend and conspiracy and made me sound theatrical in a way I wasn't. I cut the clipping out and put it in a box with other oddities. People laughed when I told them. People smiled and clucked and changed the subject when they felt they had been given enough scare. If there is an explanation that makes sense to me now, it is this: that something about that road and that night wanted me to notice. Maybe it was some coincidence of 2 men traveling who were bored, or maybe it was only my mind stitching together a set of details into a story, because stories keep things manageable. Maybe they were men who worked for some corporate job that required late travel, and they sat motionless because of a conversation we couldn't overhear. Maybe they were nothing but a car with 2 mannequins left inside for shock value. Any answer would fit if I chose to accept it. What I did not accept then, and still do not, is that the cart was a harmless prank. It felt like an intentional thing, a small, private instruction left with the care of someone who knew where I would look. That's what made it powerful. It landed, and I found it, and it was real in the way things that are close to your hands are real. I live in a different place now, with more neighbors and less night driving. I keep the porch light on sometimes, and the camera stays recording. Sometimes, in a grocery store parking lot, I see someone in a dark coat and my chest flinches, and then I remember to breathe, to count to 10, to let the moment pass without turning it into a battle. I don't want the weirdness to decide how I go through the world, so I try to be practical. There was never a big reveal. There was no man in a suit who followed me to my car and stepped out and said, "We were just checking on you." There was no tidy resolution where the sheriff called me and said they had traced the card and caught whoever did it. The arc of it is smaller, narrower, but in some ways more intense because it lived inside small choices: where I drove, what time I slept, who I called when a car idled behind me. Years later, when I drive past that county road, I sometimes slow and look out at the gravel turnout. If the night is clear, the stars are bright and the road looks empty. If I look long enough, occasionally a pair of headlights will come up behind me and track the way I turn. My hands get tight on the wheel, but most of the time I turn the other direction and keep going. The memory stays, in the way a bruise fades but never quite disappears. I don't know who those men were or why they sat so still in that car with their engine idling. I only know that they made a private, small interruption in my life and left a thin card to remind me that I had been seen. I posted it like you post anything dumb at 2 in the morning, a throwaway line, half a joke. I was on my lunch break and the sky outside the office looked weird, like someone had scrubbed the stars out in a band above the warehouses. I snapped a picture with my phone and threw a caption on it. Anybody else seeing those things over Sector 7? Plane? Drone? Alien Uber? I added a laughing face because I didn't want to sound freaked out. I didn't expect anyone to care. A few coworkers liked it, a couple of friends sent laughing replies, and then it scrolled down the feed and went away. The next morning there was a scribble on my cubicle whiteboard where someone had written, "Saw your pic, insane." Small, normal stuff. The day moved like any other. I made coffee. I filed emails. I kept checking the sky out of habit. The image in my phone felt like something I had shoved into a drawer. That afternoon the lobby door opened and 2 men walked in and sat on the couches under the flat light. They wore black suits and plain black shoes, and they didn't take off their coats even though the building was warm. It was a small lopsided lobby, a mail rack, a vending machine that smelled like old sugar, a TV tuned to a muted news loop. People came and went, but these 2 men didn't move. One of them had his hands clasped like he was holding a secret. The other kept a notebook on his knee and didn't look at it. They looked like they belonged in a different building, or a different decade. I noticed them because the receptionist glanced at them and kept her face blank. She didn't get up to talk to them. The security camera above her desk kept blinking red, like it wanted to record but couldn't decide. I made a joke to Steve from accounting about it. He didn't laugh. He said, "Those guys have been there since lunch." I thought maybe they were reps or auditors. We didn't get many auditors. I shrugged and went back to my spreadsheet. Small things started to slide around after that. My desk phone logged a call from an international number at 3 in the morning one day. I had never seen the number before. My laptop's battery dipped randomly even though the charger was plugged in. A draft of an email I had been composing, a sarcastic little paragraph about the lights I never meant to send, began appearing in the recent drafts box like someone was opening it and letting it sit. I deleted it, and then in a half hour it was there again, unchanged. When I deleted it a second time, it moved to a folder called Notes that I did not have on my account. I started to notice the men in black more. They were always in the lobby. Not always sitting in the same chairs, but always there, 2 characters in a small scene. A contractor brought in a delivery and the driver told me he'd seen them in several places that week: a gas station in the next town, a fast food joint off the highway. I didn't mention the photo on my feed to anyone except a couple of friends who made their jokes, and that was the end of it, I thought. Then the morning my team had a surprise visit from the regional director, The two men were in the lobby like they always were. The elevator dinged and the director stepped off and said hello to the receptionist and then paused when she nodded toward the couches. His smile tightened. He didn't mention them to the group in the conference room. We all joked about a new corporate security program and pushed papers. By lunchtime, the air around me felt thicker. I kept looking at my phone. A notification popped up, a comment on my picture from a user I didn't know. 3 words, saw this too. Then a DM came through, anonymous, with a screenshot of a draft email I had been writing last week about a stupid complaint I'd been drafting to HR. I had not sent it. It was saved in my notes app and I had deleted it weeks before after deciding not to cause trouble. The screenshot included the exact words I had typed, punctuation and cringe and all. I felt stupid that I felt something like panic, but the skin at the back of my neck noticed it before my head did. I walked to the lobby and the 2 men were still there. The receptionist didn't look up. There were 3 people in line at the coffee machine pretending to not notice. The men were watching a point near the window like they were watching a distant place more than the people passing through. I could see my face reflected in the glass and it was pale. Have you seen those guys before? I asked the receptionist like it was casual. She shrugged. Been with us all week. Quiet. I wanted to say something smart or funny and then the director walked past. His steps were measured, shoes tapping on tile, and when he passed the men he didn't nod. The younger of the 2 men smiled just a fraction, and the director's face moved like he had swallowed something sour. He kept going. At 3:20, I took a break. My hands trembled slightly when I made the coffee. My screensaver read update scheduled and the system message flickered that an update had failed. I shut the lid and walked to the lobby. The 2 men were seated the same, an island of black. They looked like statues until one of them moved and stood up, the movement small and economical, like someone pulling on a jacket. He came over to the reception desk and asked, "Is Dimitri here?" The receptionist said no and looked at me, expecting me to say something. I let my mouth stay shut. I had never used my full name in anything public besides outgoing emails and HR forms. It landed on my ear like a pebble. After an hour, they hadn't left. They had the same steady rhythm: sit, stand, ask for someone's name, look pointedly when they weren't provided. People in the lobby whispered about them like you whisper about a leaky pipe. My coworkers made jokes about secret shoppers and weird PR stunts. A janitor told me later that they didn't eat. He'd seen them press their hands flat on the arm of the couch and not move for long stretches. The janitor said, like they were listening. At 5, the regional director announced an impromptu meeting for all staff in 10 minutes, something about compliance and how the company respected privacy. I felt my heartbeat pick up like a metronome. The meeting room was full of people already. Fluorescent lights hummed. Someone's keycard beeped over and over in the background until it was fixed. I sat in the last row and tried to keep my breathing normal. When the director said, "Before we start," someone told me 2 of our visitors were waiting in the lobby. A lot of heads turned. I stood up, partly because I thought they might ask to speak to me and partly because my legs felt like they needed to move. The director's smile had a thinness that made me sit back down. They made me come out. That was the part that slowed everything to a surreal scrape. The receptionist walked me toward the lobby like she was delivering something fragile. The 2 men were sitting where they always sat, but now they turned as I came into the open. The younger man didn't blink. The older man smiled in a way that made the edges of his mouth small and unsettling. "You're the one who posted about the lights," the older one said. His voice was calm, as if he was reading weather. I opened my mouth to say, "Yeah, it was nothing," and the younger man cut me off by reciting my exact post out loud, word for word, including the laughing face. He said the line without punctuation, like he had read it from a screen. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't look at anything. He just said it. The words landed in the lobby like someone dropping a book on a table. Laughter fluttered from a few people who weren't listening closely. My stomach dropped. "Okay," I said, trying to be steady. "That's my post. People can screenshot stuff. Anyone can." The older man repeated the sentence of mine I had typed and then deleted 2 nights prior in my notes app. "If this thing is real, it's probably a contractor and not some government monster." I'd written that half angry, half resigned, as a draft because I didn't want to sound like someone who took their lunch break to stare at the sky. I had deleted it because it sounded petty. I hadn't posted it. No one had seen it. I had only had it on my phone. Now the man said it, not as a reading but as if he had it memorized. The room got quieter. Someone's phone dropped and hit carpet with a tiny thud that sounded very loud. I felt my pulse behind my teeth. "How do you know that?" I said. My voice came out like a question that belonged to someone else. The younger man smiled a little too soft and said, "We know what you're about to say before you do." The words moved like a small animal, quick and precise, and the way he said it made the skin along my arms tighten. People started talking at once, questions, jokes, nervous murmurs. The director tried to keep control and call for calm. Someone from HR asked for identification. The men slid a plan card across the desk like a business card but with no name and only a thin logo I couldn't place. The receptionist put it aside and said, "We're not aware of them." The director frowned and asked their purpose. They shrugged in a way that was almost polite. They didn't ask questions in a way I had expected. They didn't ask who else had seen the lights. They didn't ask where I'd been standing when I took the photo. Instead, each time someone spoke they repeated things that were too specific. When the director said, "We respect privacy," the older man said, "You respect privacy, but you monitor it." When HR asked how they had acquired certain images, the younger man recited a private draft about the password for my home Wi-Fi, something I had typed in a grocery list note to myself months ago to remember to change. I had never told it to anyone. I felt like someone had opened drawers in my head. I wanted to walk away. I wanted to step outside and breathe cold air and curse. Instead, the people around me kept listening. People filmed with their phones. The janitor took a step back into a shadow like he didn't want to be noticed. The receptionist's fingers trembled. At one point, the older man described a private memory, not something secret like a bank number, but a small stupid detail no one cares about, that I used to stand on the lower rail of the playground swing set at 9, pretending I could jump farther than I could. I hadn't written that anywhere. I hadn't told anyone except a woman in grade school who lived down the street. She didn't even remember. The older man mentioned it like he was reading a plaque. I snapped. I asked, voice higher than I intended, "Who are you? Who sent you?" They looked at each other like they were confirming a small, shared joke. The younger one shrugged. "We're observers," he said. "We were asked to collect certain things." "What things?" I asked. They both smiled the same fraction and repeated 3 lines from a draft I had been composing that morning, a sarcastic, private message I had typed into an unsent email to my friend about thinking of moving cities. The email included a name of a street I liked and the particular coffee shop I would haunt. I hadn't sent it. I hadn't told anyone the coffee shop name out loud. They said both things like they had been spoken in the room for years. And then they did something I didn't expect. One of them recited a sentence I was only thinking. It was a short, dumb thought, the kind you have about a blind corner in the parking lot where your bike had been stolen years before. I hadn't written it. I hadn't even said it out loud. I had only had it unfold in the blank space between emails a moment before speaking. The man recited it and it landed in the air, and suddenly the room seemed to be made of glass and someone could see everything on the other side. I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to run out of the lobby, but the door was full of people watching and I worried about what might happen if I ran. Instead I asked again, quieter now, "How did you get this?" "How?" The younger man leaned forward as if I had asked something interesting. He said, "You posted a passing observation. You typed a line and saved it and deleted it. You were about to tell yourself, out loud, that it was nothing and to stop thinking about it. But you didn't. We knew you were about to do it. It was a sentence built to make someone smaller. It did. I felt small, like someone had closed the room on me." People muttered about privacy and legality, and the director cleared his throat and said they'd call the police if the men didn't leave. The men didn't leave right away. They sat as if time did not apply to them. When the director mentioned the police, one of them said, "We meet with them sometimes." He said it like someone mentioning they saw a neighbor at the store. A security guard from a neighboring office walked in, summoned by the director. He asked for ID. The men produced plain cards with numbers and letters that matched nothing in our system and then folded the cards back into their wallets like they were handing over play money. The guard frowned and called a central dispatch. The call waited. The lobby hummed with the kind of silence you get when everyone is holding their breath and no one knows which one will let it out first. Eventually they did leave. Not in a hurry. Not in a dramatic way. They stood, smoothed their collars, and walked out into the street with the kind of slow confidence that said they trusted the world to not notice. People watched them go. I noticed a black car that pulled away at the curb and then idle for a long time at the corner, throw its lights on, then drive off. The director told everyone to go home. HR asked me to write an incident report. I wrote down what I could. My handwriting trembled. After that day, things layered over each other like pages in a thick book. I started keeping my phone in my desk drawer and not taking it to meetings. I stopped posting anything at all online and told a few close friends to not talk about the lights to anyone. My privacy felt like a basket of eggs and every small movement seemed like it would crack one. The calls kept coming at strange hours. Sometimes it was silence on the line. Sometimes there would be a human voice that would say only my name and hang up. I changed passwords. I changed accounts. I deleted old photos I had saved in cloud backups. I threw out an old notebook because I worried about someone finding my messy handwriting and knowing me better than strangers should. I even unplugged the smart speaker in my kitchen for a week because I worried about it listening. My friends laughed, but laughter felt like a warm thing I didn't deserve. At home, I found small things out of place. The mail in the box had a flyer that said local utilities notice folded in a way that made it look like an envelope. A sock smelled faintly of someone else's cologne. Once, the spare key under the fake rock in the garden wasn't there. I thought I had misplaced it and then found it in the mailbox like a return to sender. When I asked the neighbor, the kind older woman who watered plants when the heat got bad, she said she had seen a black car circling slowly past the cul-de-sac 3 times at night, engine off, lights down low. Her voice went small when she told me, like telling the story hurt her. I felt like every angle of my life had been turned toward a single point and no one had told me what that point meant. I went into HR again and asked for help. They offered to let me work from home for a while, and they called the police to file another report. The deputy who took my statement was polite, but the way he wrote things down made me feel like my story fit in a small box he had already used many times. Men walking into lobbies, he said, reading from his log in a voice that meant it had happened before to someone else. The sheriff's office said they would canvass the area for cameras and talk to nearby businesses. They asked if I'd like to come in and view some photos if anything turned up. It was all the kind of papering over that made me feel less safe and more documented. The shadow of those 2 men crept into other people's lives too. A coworker who called me in the weeks after we spoke said she had gotten a voicemail with static and a sound like someone clearing their throat, and then the voicemail ended with her name. A neighbor's security camera caught a dark car moving slowly past their driveway with its lights down. On a local community board, someone wrote about men in black suits who laid down on the grass outside a diner and watched the sky with binoculars and didn't move when asked to leave. The stories were small and spread thin. They could be coincidence, but the little facts layered into a pattern that made my jaw clench. One night I stayed late at the office because I wanted to look at old drafts and accounts and see if anything else had been touched. The office settled into a low hum. The cleaning crew was playing radio low in the hallway. My monitor flicked and the backup lights hummed when the building's power cycled. I scrolled through old notes and found a draft I had thought deleted, a few lines about how the sky looked like someone had taken a strip out of it and no one wanted to admit they saw it. I closed the laptop and put the note in the trash bin and then saw, reflected in the black of the screen, 2 figures by the lobby door. They were standing there as if they had never moved. I realized then that no matter how many times I told myself it would be okay, there was always a place they could come back to. The idea of being watched at a distance turned into being observed up close and intimate. My breath caught. I did something I hadn't thought I would do. I called them. Not their number, because I didn't have one, but the general number of the company that had their logo on the card. A secretary answered, and when I asked for the person listed, a pause sounded like someone riffling through paper. Then she said, "There is no one by that name. We don't have any teams in dark suits coming to lobbies." "You can check again," I said. My voice sounded thin and loud. She came back on and said there was nothing, no records. The deputy who had taken the report later told me that was common. People use names that are like nothing in a database. The black car that had idled at the corner the day they left didn't show up on any cameras. The footage from the lobby camera had a blank 5-minute gap during the time the men were there. The technician said it was a glitch. When I asked if it had been intentionally disabled, he shrugged and said sometimes old equipment did odd things. I felt suffocated by small investigations that found nothing. The men in black hadn't broken any locks, hadn't asked anyone to sign anything, hadn't forced their way into anything. They had, however, demonstrated that what was private could be public, and that things sat heavy in my chest like an instruction manual left open on a dangerous page. There was a night when I nearly did something reckless. I drove to an overlook where I could see the whole lower valley and the strip of sky where I had taken the photo. I thought maybe if I sat there long enough I could see them, or see someone coming to get them, or watch them watch. My hands were cold on the steering wheel. I called a friend and we talked about nothing until my fingers warmed. I almost turned the car off and left my lights on like a signal. Then I heard it, the soft crunch of tires on gravel behind me. The car idled not too far away. I sat very still and held my breath. After a while the sound moved off. My friend on the phone told me not to be dramatic and laughed, and I pretended the laugh was a cloak. I left the overlook and drove home with the station radio loud on purpose, like noise could push the small, keen things away. I slept with my phone under my pillow. Things calmed a little over the months that followed. Maybe the men had moved on. Maybe they had more interesting things to watch. Maybe I was less worth their attention the more I rearranged my life. I changed my routines. I stopped taking late-night drives. I logged out of social media and left my accounts cold until I felt gutsy again. I put locks on drawers. I burned a bunch of old notes in the sink and watched the ash swell gray. Burning things felt like an answer I could control. And then one afternoon, months after the lobby day that had rerouted my life, I found a small folded note slipped under my apartment door. I had been careful for weeks, hadn't left the spare keys in silly places, changed passwords, told my neighbor to call me if any car sat in the cul-de-sac for more than an hour. I nearly tripped over it because it was small and insignificant, and yet the small things always spelled the worst instructions. I bent down and picked it up. The handwriting wasn't even printed block. I didn't know. The note read only, "Stop." It was the same structural thing as the business card, a single, exact command. No signature. No explanation. Nothing you could take to the police and feel comforted by. I felt furious and infantile and very tired. I crumpled the paper and threw it away and then sat in my kitchen and felt my heart pound like a trapped animal. I called the sheriff again and filed another report. They came, took pictures, wrote it down. No prints? I asked. The deputy said no prints. No CCTV, he said. The neighbor's Ring camera didn't show anyone at the door. The porch light had cut out for 9 minutes that night, someone noted. Coincidence, maybe, but I had learned to read the world like it written in small hints. Eventually I started to move in bigger ways. I rented a storage unit and put some things there. I boarded up what I could in the apartment I felt they had noticed, and then I moved states. I told my sister I was leaving and she asked if she should come help, and she did, and we packed boxes in the rain and got a truck and drove with the radio on and didn't look back until we were on the highway and the small houses of my neighborhood were a blur in the rear view. After I left, the calls slowed to nothing. The empty numbers stopped. The voicemail that had only ever said my name became a dead line. Months after the move, I checked a utility of my old apartment and it was closed for renovations. The neighbor said later, in passing, that the lobby finally installed a new camera system and they had the place scanned for bugs and found nothing. He said he sometimes saw a black car at the corner late at night and sometimes didn't. The world kept going in its thin, ordinary way. I never saw the faces of those men up close. I never learned who they worked for. I never had the satisfaction of folding a photo and saying, "That's them." All I had were small things that stayed, the feeling of being under someone's attention, the knowledge that even thoughts and drafts I hadn't published could be plucked out of private places, and the card with the word notice that had landed under my windshield wiper one morning like a small, exact weapon. I kept copies of my reports and the photos of the note and the old card in a locked box. I changed my routines until they felt ordinary again. I learned to let the ordinary win. I put curtains up on my windows that night and kept the porch light on a little longer. I stopped leaving my phone in easy reach. I told a few people, close ones, the real details, and kept the rest as a small ember in a dented tin. The ember didn't go out, it just got put away. The last thing I'll say is this: the worst part wasn't them in the lobby repeating my words. It was that the world felt smaller afterward, like there were less safe places to tuck thoughts, and like anything slight could be heard by someone who had already decided to listen. I moved across town, then across states, and I changed jobs and got a dog and learned where to go for coffee in a town that didn't know the sound of my laughter. I slept with the light off eventually. The echo of their voices lived like a small bruise under the skin of my life. I woke up sometimes with the exact sentence they had predicted barely on the edge of my mouth and had to swallow it back like a secret. I survived it. I locked things down and walked differently and called the sheriff and did the paperwork and moved. That final, dull fact that I walked out and kept breathing and shut the door behind me is the thing I hold on to. They left a small, precise trace in my life, and I erased what I could. The rest I carried like a pocket of silence that made me watchless and watchful at once. We left early because we wanted the cooler air. It was late October and the mountain got that smell of damp leaves and pine gum and something like old rain. I hadn't been outside in weeks. My girlfriend, Jenna, and I had packed sandwiches and a thermos and that stupid little speaker she insisted on bringing even though I told her it was unnecessary. We parked at the trailhead at 8, boots still dry, the lot almost empty. A pickup truck was tucked under a tree on the far side and a single SUV with a kid's bike strapped to the back. Other than that, nothing. The hike was the kind of stupidly easy thing people post pictures of: a loop, a few rocky outcrops, a little stream with a footbridge. We walked slow, talking about nothing much: work, the landlord, which pizza place was worse but closer. The sky was clear above the trees, blue like someone had painted it. Birds sang. A squirrel banged a branch and a chipmunk skittered across the trail. The world was fine. Then we saw the thing. It came from the northwest, low and rolling along under the treetops. It was too low to be a plane and too sleek to be any kind of private chopper I'd ever seen. It was long, like a shadow, with a shape not exactly round, not exactly straight, and it made no sound. I mean, there was no engine hiss, no rotor chop. For a second I thought it was a banner plane, and my brain tried to line up advertising and safe explanation, but that made no sense because there was nothing attached and the surface looked matte and dark, like someone had painted it with the sky color to avoid being noticed. Jenna saw it at the same time I did. We stopped. The speaker slipped from her hand and landed with a soft thump on the leaves. The bird calls died like someone had switched them off. The thing skimmed across the clearing and under the lobes of the trees, and then it was gone. No trace, just the wind and the smell of crushed leaves. We stood where we were for too long after that, like people in a theater when the curtain fell and no one clapped. I told myself it had been a drone, big and expensive. Jenna said maybe someone was making a movie. We both called back the explanations in our heads to see which stuck. Neither stuck. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, 2 hours later, my shirt had a sweat patch under my pack and my boots had scraped gravel on the soles. The lot had changed. There were 2 cars now by the sign, one parked right next to ours that hadn't been there when we left. It was a black sedan, glossy in that new car way, windows dark, no bumper stickers, no dent, license plate present, but the numbers didn't mean anything to me. I would have noticed it when we parked because it was close and the parking area had been almost empty. It wasn't there. We didn't stop. We locked the car and climbed in like people who had something to hide. Jenna said, maybe they're waiting for someone. Her voice jittered like loose wire. I nodded and told her to put on her seatbelt so it sounded normal. When I pulled out the keys, I could see the people inside the sedan through the windshield because the guys had the windows down about an inch. 2 of them. Both in black suits, plain white shirts, thin black ties. Their hair was short and tidy. They were sitting perfectly still and watching us the way someone watches for a cue. I didn't understand it at first. Their faces were casual, neutral, not strange smiling, but there was a measured, empty quality to the way they held themselves, like wax figures propped in a car. We pretended not to notice. I put the car in drive like I always did and eased out. The black sedan didn't move. It stayed where it was, engine silent. We drove off and I checked the rear view when the road turned a hairpin. It was still there, parked where it had been, a black blot next to the trees. I told Jenna she was overreacting 3 times on the drive home. She told me to stop saying that because it made her feel insane. We tried to joke, like people do. Movie extras, I said. We're in someone's indie film. She laughed, breathy and thin, but the laugh didn't get past her mouth. I kept checking the rear view. The black car did not appear behind us until we hit the county road, an hour after the trail. For a long stretch it was nothing, the highway open, radio on, me singing too loud to forget the image of that mad shape above the trees, and then, suddenly, there it was, a pair of headlights in the lane behind like someone had slid another car into the world and aimed it at us. It followed at a steady distance, not tailgating, not slow, just present. If I sped up it matched me. If I slowed it stayed the same distance. When we passed through a town and I turned down a side street to duck into a grocery to make sure it wasn't me losing my mind, it turned too. We were careful, pulled into the lot, waited under neon, took our time. The black sedan parked on the far side, engine off, two silhouettes visible in the front seats, shoulders turned slightly as if to watch the doors. I told Jenna we should go in and buy something stupid, like it would make us look normal. She wanted to stay in the car with the doors locked. I wanted to pretend I was brave. We compromised with a bottle of water and 2 pretzels and walked the whole time like people carrying a secret, checking windows and counting cars. Back in the car, the sedan was still there. We tried to make ourselves see common things. Maybe the men were lost. Maybe they had stopped after their car broke down and someone else had come to help. None of it fit. It was the stillness again, the way they watched with no muscle movement, like a recorded image. Over the next week we kept an eye for the car. We told a couple of people who laughed polite nervous laughs and said not to worry. Jenna told her friend Megan and Megan said it was probably some asshole prank. I called my brother and he wanted to hunt the men down with a flashlight and a baseball bat. I promised I wouldn't do anything dramatic and then I did anyway. I drove the same loop alone late one night to see if the sedan would be on the side of the road. It wasn't. I drove slower than I needed to, windows down and coffee in a Go cup, waiting for the headlights to appear. They did, eventually. Not right behind me this time, but in the distance, like a specter that had chosen to materialize. The little things started piling up. We'd go to sleep and the front porch light would be off, though we never turned it off. We'd leave for a few hours and come back to find the spare key we hid under a fake rock on the garden wall pushed forward so you could see the plastic edge. Once, my phone battery plunged from 46% to 3% in a half hour and then jumped back to 52 with no warning. I blamed the old phone and then blamed myself for blaming the phone. Jenna said she got a voicemail one morning with nothing on it but breathing, 3 deep inhales and then a click. I played it for her and felt the hairs along my forearms stand proud. The voicemail was silent except for that rhythm. The date stamp showed it had come in at 2:04 a.m. One night we woke to the sound of a car idling near the house, like someone was sitting and listening. It was just past midnight. I went to the front window and could see nothing but the silhouette of a tree and the streetlight's orange halo. The sound wasn't close to the house, but close enough that you felt the low hum through the floor. I texted Jenna not to move and then I texted my brother. My brother texted back a meme and then called to ask if I wanted him to come by. I said no because I knew if he came loud footsteps might start and we didn't need that. The hum left after a while. The men in the car never left fingerprints on anything as far as we could tell. The fake rock had fingerprints where you'd expect smudged, smoothed, but when we talked to the neighbors about it, an old woman down the street said she'd seen the black car a few nights earlier parked under the next block's streetlight like it was waiting for someone. She said she didn't bother calling the police because it seemed like someone who worked nights. When we asked the sheriff's office, they were politely uncertain and suggested we keep records and if things escalated to call 911. They were not dismissive. They were precise and official in a way that made me think they had seen Stranger Things before and couldn't tell if this was one of those things. 2 weeks after the hike, I had a night shift and left Jenna sleeping. I drove up the highway at 2 a.m. with the windows cracked a bit and the heat on just to keep the glass fogged. The sedan came up behind sometime after midnight and matched my tempo like a metronome. I took an exit and the car followed, matching my slow drift as I wound through dark farm roads. I pulled into a convenience store and let the lights wash my face. Inside, the fluorescent hum turned the whole place blue. I bought a candy bar and held it like a talisman. While I walked out, the black car sat under the light like it had been waiting for me to come back. I walked like I had something to do, back to the street, pretending not to see. The 2 men were visible through the windshield. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I could see their hands on their knees. They had a look that made me think of people in an old photograph who always look slightly off because the camera took too long to capture them. One of them tilted his head the way someone listens for a name. The car did not move. I bought gum and changed my route. I drove home as if my life was unaltered, like my hands didn't tremble when I unlocked the door. I told Jenna in the morning I might have imagined 1,000 things. She told me she'd had the breathing voicemail again that night, and this time it stopped after a scraping sound like someone dragging bare thumb across a page. We tried to be sensible. We told ourselves we were being watched, but not in the way that meant harm. We were being watched like a TV show that someone wanted to sit in on. We started keeping a written log. Date, time, what we saw. It was boring at first. October 26, 2:04 voicemail. November 1st, idling car outside, and then it began to look like a strange diary of angles and small patterns. The idling happened more often on nights I worked, as if whoever it was timed things for when we were alone. The car appeared at the trailhead again once, a week after we first saw it, parked further back so it wouldn't be obvious from the lot. The two men sat in the same pose. This time, Jenna stepped out while I pretended to tie my shoe. She walked to the car in the way people go to get a better look at a strange animal. The men didn't look at her directly. Her phone was in her hand and she took a photo that looked like fog in a windshield smeared with leaf spray. She lowered the phone and saw them watching, and she came back quickly. "We should call the police when it parks like that," she said, voice small. I said I would, and I didn't. I told myself the sheriff's office had better things to do than chase two suited men sitting in a car. That was the justification every fearful person uses to do nothing and then regret it. The first time they approached the car was by accident for us. We had driven out to a small overlook, a tourist spot with a paybox in the summer and now empty, the asphalt cracked and lonely. We wanted to sit and listen to the wind for a few minutes. The black sedan rolled up 5 minutes after we had parked. It halted at the entrance like it had been instructed to wait. The two men stepped out with a quietness that made the night air feel louder. They walked in that slow, odd way, not confident swagger, but a patient, precise step. They didn't hurry. They didn't smile. They came to a stop 10 feet away from our passenger window and let us see them. We rolled my window halfway down because I had this idea that being polite might disarm them. I'm not a brave man. I thought if I spoke they would be less likely to do something weird. They looked at each other like they were confirming a line, and then they looked at me. "Did you see something last week?" the taller one asked. His voice was calm, without inflection. He didn't ask our names. He didn't show any badge. There was no title on his coat. He sounded like a man reading a weather update. "We did," Jenna said. Her voice was steady in a way that surprised me. She said, "Yeah. Thing flew low." They did not ask me questions about the aircraft. They didn't flash any credentials. They repeated to the exact syllable what Jenna had muttered to me in the car on the way home, a line I had thought no one else had heard. It skimmed the tops, like it was cutting the trees in half. Jenna went even paler. She hadn't told them. I hadn't either. We had said it in the car, only to each other. The man didn't look at us when he said it. He didn't look at his hands. He looked at the road like he was reading a map. "How do you know that?" I asked. My voice was too loud in the night. "We collected some things," the shorter man said. He had paper in his hands that he never opened. "We were in the area." "Like a survey?" I asked. My brain tried to pin it to something procedural. The shorter man smiled in a way that thinned his mouth. "People say things," he said. "They write things. They talk." It felt like a non-answer designed to make me think of 1,000 wrong things. They moved back from the car and then got in. Their steps were soft. The sedan turned and left the overlook, lights tucked low like a secret at the back of a stage. We sat there and neither of us could speak for a long time. It wasn't until we had driven a few miles that Jenna finally sighed and said, "We should call." We called the sheriff, we told them about the car and the men, and we told them about the aircraft. The deputy who answered asked our location and took notes and promised to check the area. He told us he'd patrol the road that night and that we should call immediately if the car came back. I felt a little better, the way you do when someone says the right procedural words. The deputy showed up in the early hours of the morning, a truck with a floodlight that made the world hard with shadows. He checked the overlook. He checked the lot. He asked for descriptions which we fumbled through in the raw hours. He took our names and offered his card. He said he'd run the plate if we could get it. We didn't have it. We had no clear shots of their faces, just the shape of black suits against the night. He told us to make sure we locked doors and to call if they showed up at the house. He was kind but practical. I read his report later and the words were precise and sensible and made me feel like maybe a government office had put our nervousness into a box. We tried to go back to normal. We tried to have friends over. The men showed up at a distance. Once, at a friend's wedding in a town over, I thought I saw a dark blur of a car sitting at the rear of the parking lot. Maybe it was a rental someone used to leave that night. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe paranoia is how brains keep us safe sometimes. The men escalated in ways that were small but meant everything. They started appearing off and on at places we went: a grocery parking lot, a diner on a highway exit, a filling station on a road we didn't normally take. Sometimes I would glance in the rear view and they'd be there at a distance, matching my speed. It was always the same sedan, same dark glass, two men in suits who didn't move when they sat. Once I saw the passenger stand and looked directly into my car through the side window in a way that made my hands go cold. He nodded and the motion was so small it could have been a muscle twinge. My mouth went dry and my palms pressed into the wheel like of ice. One night, when Jenna and I were driving south to visit her parents, the sedan pulled into the lane behind us on the highway like it had been following our exit. We thought the highway would be safe because of the traffic and lights. We were wrong. The car matched us from a distance and then slid closer until its bumper was the shadow at the back of our car, like a hand at our sternum. Jenna started to breathe faster. I zoned out the radio and told myself to keep my hands steady. I took the next exit and the sedan followed us off. I sped up and it matched. I got off at a cluster of lights and pulled into a strip mall with a laundromat and a taco place and a 24-hour pharmacy. The lot was half empty. I parked near the drugstore entrance so people could see us. The sedan parked about 3 rows back and the men sat like statues. We went inside the store and pretended to browse. Jenna said we should tell the cashier and she almost did, and then she didn't. The men stayed. At one point the taller one stepped out and walked to the edge of the lot and stood like someone testing the range of a light. He never walked inside. He watched the pharmacy door and the utility pole and then moved back to his car. We went back to the car and sat for a long time, watching him watch us under sodium light. I wanted to shout, to rattle the windows, to do something that might make them flinch. Instead, I called 911 from the parking lot and told the operator what was happening. She asked where we were and what the car looked like and if they had any plate numbers. I told her I didn't know. Her voice was steady. She said a cruiser would be there right away. The cruiser did come. The police truck rolled into the lot and the officer got out and walked toward the black car. The 2 men sat and watched him approach. The officer walked up, exchanged a few words with them, and then came to our car. He told us they had identification, but that the men had said they were on assignment and would be moving on. The officer said he couldn't hold them because they had not committed any crime. I felt something in my chest like someone had folded a sheet over it, a sense that the men were allowed to be at large even if they were making us feel hunted. We didn't sleep that night. We drove to Jenna's parents' house and slept with the lights on and the TV loud. In the morning her father said it sounded like something out of a movie and suggested we move our weekend and sleep over at his place whenever we could. He said he'd keep an eye out. He joked to lighten the air and we laughed, and then the laugh was weak. The pattern tightened. The men were never violent. They did not try to break into anything. They never left a note. That was part of the terror. Their restraint was a tool. They taught us through omission that they could do more but chose not to. They were precise. They lasted longer in their watching than most people could stand. The worst night was on the highway at dusk because it forced us to confront what staying meant. We had been at a weekend fair upstate and were driving back when the sedan pulled up behind us near sunset. Traffic was thick. The car slid between lanes and came up beside us at the light and then fell back into the lane behind. For a while it matched the flow and we all just moved with the river of cars. The sky darkened and the highway lights blinked on like a guardrail of stars. The sedan matched us and then pulled up directly behind as if to test how close it could be without causing a crash. I started to feel like the air in the car had been replaced with something heavier. I drove to the next exit, a rest stop with an overhead sign advertising clean bathrooms and free coffee. I figured we could talk to real people and make them witnesses. The lot had a handful of cars. We pulled in and the sedan followed us off the ramp and parked near the restrooms like it had been waiting for our arrival. It was close enough that I could see the two men, the black suits, the way the tie on the shorter one was perfectly knotted. I killed the engine and waited. The sound of the highway was a low wash and the rest stop had an irritating hum under the neon lights. I turned to Jenna and tried to make myself sound rational. "We'll go and ask for someone, get the police," I said. She nodded and we walked to the restrooms together like kids in a haunted house. On the way back to the car we were careful to look casual. The sedan's windows were rolled down and both of the men were standing outside now, as if they had nothing else to do. They stood a few feet from our bumper, hands at their sides. Up close they were not unkind. They were ordinary. They were almost boring except for the way their faces didn't have the crinkle of people who smiled a lot. They smiled a sliver. They smelled faintly like aftershave and paper. We came up to the passenger side and the taller one turned his head and said, "You should not speak about it." It was not a demand that raged. It was flat and small and precise like an instruction manual sentence. Jenna balked. "Who are you?" she asked. They didn't introduce themselves. They said our first names. The shorter one said my name and Jenna's in the even, casual tone that made my stomach drop. The littlest sounds of my name somehow tightened the world. "How do you know our names?" I asked. The taller one looked at me with eyes that were clear and dry. "We saw you when you saw the aircraft," he said. "We were nearby. We were asked to look in certain places," the shorter one added. His voice had a lilt like someone who makes speech a job. We laughed then, small and stupid. The laugh was a thin thing and sounded ridiculous even as it left our throats. "Asked by who?" I said. They both smiled the same fraction and the taller one said, "We asked you to keep quiet." Or maybe he said, "We would prefer you to be quiet." The words blurred. I remember thinking how ordinary the words sounded, but how heavy they felt. They were not threats delivered with a swagger or with malice. They were carelessly delivered as if the men were the kind of people who managed maintenance and asked tenants kindly not to make noise after 11. The effect was worse than a growl. It was the power of someone who had everything in hand and didn't need to prove they did. "Look," I said. "We saw a weird thing. We're not making trouble. If you want us to forget, we will." The words tasted false. I wanted to leave the smallest footprint. The shorter man smiled again. "No," he said. "That's not necessary." He said something else then that made my throat close like I had been punched. He repeated exactly what I had joked to Jenna about on the trailhead before the black car even showed up, a stupid line I had thought only the two of us heard. Maybe they were checking the cell phone towers. I hadn't posted it online. I hadn't said it to anyone else. I had said it as an attempt to be funny. He said it like something he'd read. He did not look at our faces when he said it. "How did you hear that?" Jenna asked. Her voice had an edge now. The taller man put his hands together and then opened them. "We listen," he said simply. "We know things. We prefer discretion. It keeps people calm." "I want to call the police," I said. I hated how small the sentence sounded. The shorter man's face was blank for a second and then it smoothed into the half smile. He nodded as if someone had asked for a soda. "You can call them," he said. "They will check the cameras and file a report. Nothing more." When I made the call, the deputy was, again, patient and took our statements and said he would keep an eye on the area. He looked at the men and then away like someone who had seen those faces before and wanted to know whether to be alarmed. He didn't arrest them. He couldn't without reason. The men told the deputy they were on official business, and the deputy accepted that with the sort of resignation you get from people who have to decide whether a story is worth going to trial over. The men left and I watched them go, small and exact like they were always meant to leave. The sedan started and peeled away into the highway. We left a rest stop an hour later with the deputy's card in the glove box and the sort of headaches you get when worry sits in your skull. We drove to Jenna's parents and slept in a bed with the lamp on, and in the morning the world looked normal like it always does. The follow-ups were what you expect and what you don't. The sheriff's office called and said they canvassed traffic cameras along the stretch and found a car matching the make and model of the black sedan passing at various times, but with license plates that were inconsistent across cameras. Plates that blurred were changed in the footage. The tech said it looked like a glitch, but he didn't laugh when he said it. The voicemail I received later that night, the one with the breathing, now had a line of static and then a click. We kept records. We saved times and wrote things down in chronological order like a ritual. I stopped going out at night. Jenna changed her running route. We swapped our spare key to a neighbor we trusted and told them to call if the black car appeared. The men in the sedan continued to show, from time to time. The frequency decreased. Sometimes weeks went by with no sign. Sometimes they would sit, quietly, for a week at the lot near the trailhead and no one else saw them. Once I found a thin business card slipped under the windshield wiper of my car when I returned from work. It had no name, only a small circle embossed on the top left and the words, "Please consider not mentioning this." The letters were typewriter neat and the ink felt cheap. We turned the card over and set it in a drawer. Jenna wanted to burn it and I wanted to keep it for evidence. We did neither. We took a picture and sent it to the deputy and he frowned and said he'd run it through county investigations. Nothing turned up. The deputy was polite and human but limited by laws and time. He called and left messages. Once he came by with a cup of coffee and said they were checking other calls in nearby counties for similar reports. He said some people see things and then the trail goes cold. I don't blame him for being methodical. I needed method. The method was not enough. Months stretched. We learned habits like animals learn trauma. We checked the rear view. We parked under lights when we could. We installed motion sensors and a cheap camera on the porch. The camera caught raccoons and the neighbor's toddler cycling past, but every time we reviewed footage from nights we thought the car might have come by, there would be a blank patch in the recording, a jump of 5-6 minutes where the file looked like it had been napped away. The first time I showed the deputy the glitch, he sighed and said, "Old equipment." The second time he said, "Possible interference." The third time he said nothing and the silence rang in me like someone waiting for a signal that never came. There was the last time the men made themselves overt. We had been planning a longer camping trip to get away. The idea was to find a place that was a bit farther off the grid and pretend nothing could follow us. We packed and drove and laughed like people do before something deliberate stops them. On the second night, as we were driving back from the general store for a forgotten sandwich and a bag of ice, the black sedan appeared in the lane behind us and slid up close like it had done before on the highway. It followed for a long time, and then came up alongside as we turned at a red light and glided in front of us, then slowed. Without warning, the shorter man stepped out of his car in the middle of the lane and stood there like a statue. He lifted his hand and nodded toward the side road. For a second, I thought he needed help. He looked ordinary in the light, a man in a suit leaning on a sedan, but there was something wrong about walking in the road in a suit like that. I swerved around him, horn blaring, a driver unhinged and angry, and the man stood like he had not heard. The light changed. He stepped off the asphalt and into the verge, and the sedan pulled away. I drove the next hours like a wolf, taking highways and back roads and forgetting the idea of home. I called every deputy I could get on the line and asked for help. A patrol cruiser followed us for a stretch and then said they had to respond to a domestic. The man who came out said we had no grounds to detain the pair and that if we wanted a restraining order we would need proof of a crime. Proof. The word felt like a hammer. In the end, what broke them was not a police trap or a showdown with batons. It was my phone and an accidental click. Jenna was sitting beside me and suggested we head to the interstate and get us off those smaller roads. I misclicked on the Maps app and set the route to the interstate a little earlier than usual. The black sedan, which had been riding our tail like a shadow, followed us to the on-ramp and then pulled into the lane next to us, matching, for one long pause, and then the driver tapped the steering wheel once, a gesture like someone deciding, and pulled away, merging with truck traffic in a way that dissolved it. We did not sleep that night. We drove to the nearest city and then a motel, and I sat in the parking lot with the car idling and called Jenna's father and my brother and the sheriff's office and made everyone who would listen promise to check in on us. We booked a plane the next morning and bought one-way tickets to a town 3 states over where none of our neighbors knew our name. We left the car at the motel and caught a morning flight, jittery and raw and stupid with adrenaline. The black sedan did not follow us to the airport. I checked the rear view at every stop and listened for engine noise like a man who had lost his sense and was trying to find it again. We landed and rented a car that was ridiculous for a city and drove to a furnished apartment on the edge of a different state where the trees were maple and the river rushed, where radios sounded different and the sky was not the sky I had known. Time started to close around the memory like hands. We told the sheriff about where we were. They filed the cards and the logs and the voicemails. They said they'd file it, and if the car turned up on any cameras they would move. Sometimes the deputy called with an update. We ran the plate. It came back on a stolen car that had been recovered. No matches on the plate, but similar models were seen. The language was a soft eraser over hard things. We moved again, a year later, to a place with more neighbors and a small park where children ran in daylight and adults complained about the birds. We sold the car we had during that fall and drove to somewhere we had never been. The black sedan did not find us there. Months turned into a year and then 2, and sometimes at night I woke up and counted the breaths Jenna took and thought about how volatile quiet could be. I deleted voicemails and saved nothing in my phone. I stopped posting about stupid little things. I told myself that if the men did not come for us, it was because we were not worth their attention anymore, or because a line had been crossed and they moved on. Both things could be true. Once, at a farmer's market 2 summers later, I saw a man in a black suit across the lane from a stall selling tomatoes. He stood like someone absent-mindedly reading a price list. He wasn't watching me. He might have been anyone's uncle. For a breath I felt that old sharpness in my gut, and then I turned away and bought 2 peaches like someone who had learned to keep small pleasures in her fist. Jenna squeezed my hand in the crowd and we walked away like people who had rented themselves a normal afternoon. I kept a business card in a box of small things, a ticket stub, a dried leaf, a wedding napkin. Sometimes I would pull it out and the letters on it would look ridiculous and small. Please consider not mentioning this. I would laugh a little in the quiet like someone who is trying to step over a puddle in the dark and finds it was only a shadow. I burned the voicemails I had saved years ago and called the deputy to confirm the logs were on file. He told me they were. He said they'd mark our report active but not active. He used words that meant the file was open and closed at the same time. We had nightmares occasionally for a while. They weren't the dramatic kind. We dreamed of gaps in recordings, of two unblinking faces in the end of a hallway, of small polite notes. We learned to check locks twice and to park under lamps even if it meant walking 15 yards. We started buying our own groceries from markets with larger lots and kept the doors locked in a way that felt like installing armor. The men in black never returned to our lives in the way they had before. There were a few sightings in towns over the years, a Reddit post from a city we'd never been to about two suited men who asked everyone at a bus station to be quiet, and sometimes my ears pricked and I wondered at the pattern. I wanted to think it was random people, pranksters, corporate reps with bad timing. But the part of me that had watched the way they sat in the sedan, like twin punctuation marks, never let me forget. I learned how to live around that attention. I took up running in daylight and made sure Jenna knew where I was. We moved again when a job offer came along, the kind of change that felt big and practical. We started keeping our own charms, a spare key on a chain in the living room and not under rocks. We were not reckless. We lived responsibly, boringly. There is courage in boring choices after threats. The last time the idea of them came back heavy was a year after we left for good. I was at a conference in a city near the mountains and walked alone to a bar known for being friendly to strangers. I stood at the counter and, while waiting for my drink, glanced toward the window and saw a black sedan across the street. It had a different plate. Two men sat in the front. They did not look up. For half a second my breath left me and I felt the old panic like a cold rush. I finished the drink in one swallow and went outside slow, pretending the bar's noise didn't thunder in my chest. The car stayed parked for a few minutes and then pulled away like a person who changed their mind. I did not call anyone. I did not report it. I walked back through the city feeling older and small. I didn't need new evidence to remember the old scar. We had papered over the worst edges of that time with cheap lighter fluid and a lot of moving boxes. Well, I will say plainly, we survived. We left the area and the car and the men behind in the sense that they did not follow us across state lines. They were a pattern on a map, a footprint that didn't translate to a path. We changed our lives around the memory and found a way to keep going. It was not a dramatic victory. It was a slow, practical rearrangement of the furniture of our lives. We kept our doors locked, our phones charged, and our friends close. We taught ourselves to notice and to act. We learned to treat small things, a voicemail, a stranger's stillness, with the seriousness they deserve. There are nights when the wind is high and the leaves clap against the house like applause, and I half expect to see a light skim the treetops. Sometimes my hands tighten on the wheel of a car follows at dusk. Sometimes Jenna gets a voicemail with a breath and deletes it without listening. Sometimes we laugh about that first day on the trail the way you tell a story that used to make you shake. But the story is always beneath our skin, and sometimes I pull it out to check that it's still there and still small. I keep the card in a box because I am a man who likes evidence. It's a small thing, cheap paper, neat letters. I look at it sometimes and feel stupid and proud and small and safe, all at once. We went on to marry and have a house with a mailbox that gets junk mail and a dog who barks at midnight crows. We go hiking but avoid the county road on the way. We talk about the aircraft sometimes, because a strange thing needs to be named. We do not talk about the men much. When we do, It is to give each other the exact name on the back of the hand, watch, or pause, or don't tell. Those words are how we keep the story from turning into something larger than it was. In the end, the worst part was not that two men in identical suits followed us for a while. The worst part was the little rules they forced us to live by afterward. They made a map of what we could and couldn't say out loud. They taught us how quickly something ordinary becomes suspicious. They re-taught us how to be careful. That is not a haunting you get rid of with salt. It's a skill you keep. It's something you carry in your pocket like a folded note. You don't show it to anyone you don't trust. You don't forget where you put it. And every so often, when the sky looks wrong or a dark car comes up in the mirror, you check it again and fold it back into your pocket and keep driving. I was 2 hours out of the mountains and still wearing the grit in my shoes when I realized my apartment door wasn't locked. I noticed it from the car, because the little porch light was on, not the bulb I left on, the neighbor's motion light that usually stayed off until someone walked by. At first I thought I'd left it that way, sleep muddled, keys loose in my pocket. I told myself whatever I'd left out in the field wasn't important. I'd been chasing a weird light over the ridge all day. I had tape and notes and a voice recorder full of interviews. I told myself I'd deal with the door when I stepped inside. The hallway smelled like the building does when it's too quiet, old coffee, dryer lint, dust warmed up. I fumbled for keys and the knob turned easy. The deadbolt was slid back. Nobody had taken anything. The laptop on my desk was where I left it, the cameras in their bag, the wallet in the bowl I used as a catch-all. The place looked exactly like it always did and not at all like it always did, a difference you feel in your gut before your eyes can name it. On the desk, right where my notes should be, sat a small cassette recorder. I use field recorders, little digital boxes, and I don't own a tape machine. The cassette was dusty on one edge like someone had kept it in a pocket for a while. There was a strip of black tape over the label slot. No name. No sticker. It looked out of place the way a bone looks out of a box of clean shirts. A radio was playing low in the background on the kitchen counter, some talk station. I remember thinking I hadn't turned it on. The air felt thicker, like someone had closed the windows but left the porch light on. I moved like a man who had seen too many horror movies, slow, deliberate. I did not touch the recorder. I stood there and listened to the kitchen clock tick and to the talk radio saying things about taxes I didn't understand. I had been in the mountains since dawn. The assignment was simple on paper. A handful of reports came in from hikers and a regional Facebook group, odd lights low over County Road 12, odd enough that the sheriff's dispatch had logged 2 calls. I took a camera and a notebook and drove up to see. The hike was short, the trail muddy, and the ridge was full of people who were trying to name what they'd seen. The thing I saw was quiet and low. It wasn't a plane the way I know planes. I tried to shoot it and my camera's autofocus kept hunting like it was looking for a face. I took field notes and recorded 2 hikers and one woman who bent her head and stared at her palms as if to measure the way her hands shook. I called the sheriff from the edge of the tree line and told them where I was. The deputy said thanks and that someone might swing by if more calls came in. That was all I expected, a couple of notes, a piece for the paper, maybe a funny headline. Back in the apartment, the cassette looked like the first real break in the ordinary. I picked it up like a man picks up something hot. It had kind of weight to it. My fingers left prints. There was a tiny crack in one corner. On the desk beside it lay a half-full coffee cup I remembered finishing in the car. I did not drink it. I put the cassette on top of my notes and hit play. The tape hissed. It had that old tape smell, like attic paper and dust. Then my phone's ringtone unspooled from the tiny speaker and I heard my voice, talking. It was the call I'd made from the tree line. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the way my voice dropped when I tried to be professional. I could hear the words I had used to set the deputy straight about the location. I could hear my questions, exactly how I had phrased them. Do you see anything out here? Anything moving? And the deputy answering as he had in the field. It played back like an echo. The quality was wrong. My phone's line had been cleaned that day. My headphones had been in my pocket. Somehow this tape had everything, even the exact silence between sentences, the cough that I'd stifled, the way my voice clipped when I said County Road 12. I hit stop and my hands shook. I sat down at the desk and pressed play again. The tape filled the room with my voice and his, and, under it all, a thin background hum that I hadn't heard live. At the end of the tape, something else came through. A voice, male, close-mic'd, calm. You saw nothing, it said. No breath, no emphasis. The words dropped into the room like a small, cold stone. I rewound the tape and listened to that line another 3 times. The recorder made the little mechanical sound like a throat clearing when it rewound. The voice didn't need to be loud to feel like somebody had been standing over me when it said it. I imagined the voice with a suit and a short haircut and shoes that clicked on tile. The image came unbidden and made me angry at myself for thinking in cliché. I called my editor. His name is Mark and he used to be a cop, so he understands procedure. I told him, someone's in the apartment. I did not tell him about the tape at first. I told him the door was unlocked. He told me to leave the place alone and come to the office. He said he'd wait. I told him to call the sheriff. He said, "You saw any signs of forced entry?" I said no. I told him about the cassette only when I was already at the car. The deputy took the cassette, because that's what deputies do. They take evidence in the neat plastic bags and ask questions in a voice that means they might believe you, but they will need a lot more before they will bet anything on you. He dusted around the door with his gloved fingers and found nothing new. "Whoever was here walked careful," he said. He didn't sound like a man who thought secret agents had been scrabbling through my drawers. He sounded like a man who was already thinking the simplest answer: kids, prank, a sloppy tenant. I am not melodramatic, at least not by temperament. I put notes in brackets, made fun of the tape to myself, tried to write a paragraph that started with "local hikers reported" and ended with "authorities investigating." I ate a sandwich and forgot the last line. I shoved the recorder in my bag because you don't leave physical things behind when you want to prove something later. I went to the paper because that's what you do when you are a journalist and scared. You go to the place that remembers your byline and the deputy and the editor and some coffee. That afternoon everything smelled like plastic and bleach. I played the tape in my office with the door locked and the blinds down. The deputy had put the machine in an evidence bag and slipped it to me like a liability. I recorded the file to my phone, though you can tell tape from digital if you know where to listen. There was a low, pulsing artifact under my voice on the tape that my recorder in the field had never picked up. It sounded for all the world like a distant alternator or like someone running a magnet along a cassette head. When I slowed it down, there was a pitch that matched no natural noise I know. Later, I'd learned what a forensic lab calls background carrier signal. For then, it just sounded like an itch no one could scratch. The next week built slowly into a pressure I could feel physically. The little events piled up and settled into patterns, a voicemail from an unknown number that played back with 2 seconds of my own breathing before a line of white noise, my external drive showing a corrupted file that matched the clip I had published about the lights but with 5 seconds extra at the end, a pause and then nothing. A hotel clerk down in town who said 2 men in dark coats had asked to rent a room just to plug in a laptop and stare out the window for hours. The men didn't touch anything. They paid in cash. I started following small rules without deciding to. I did not leave my camera unattended. I locked doors even when I was in my apartment. I told myself the tape was the stupidest, strangest thing possibly related to the day I'd been in the hills. I told myself more complicated stories, that someone with an old tape recorder had copied the digital file to annoy me, or that someone at the dispatch center had a hobby of archiving calls and had accidentally sent it to a copier. Each theory was weaker than it felt in my head. People noticed. The newsroom becomes a chorus of concern when you start saying the same thing twice over. Mark came by my desk one evening and said, "You okay?" I told him I was. He didn't look like he believed it. He asked if I wanted to take the weekend off. I told him honestly that I couldn't. I needed to be the one to follow this. That's part showman. I dislike leaving the moment for someone else, and part survival. If I chased the story, maybe I would feel like I was in charge. I started to keep a log. Date, time, what happened. I'm good with logs. They're concrete. On the first entry was the mountain, the witness interviews, the time I called dispatch. The second entry was the tape. Midweek, the logs got stranger. A woman I'd interviewed in the field called and left a message on my phone. She sounded panicked in a way that felt like it could be pinned to a single cause. She said someone had come to her mailbox and left a small sealed envelope with photocopies of her own Facebook posts dating back 6 months. They were not the public posts. They were photos she'd saved to draft and never uploaded. Her voice cracked when she said she had put the envelope back where it was and that now she wished she had kept it. The voice on the tape at the end, "You saw nothing," came back to me in a different key. A colleague, Leah, texted a grainy photo from her apartment building's security camera. In the still, 2 figures in suits were in the lobby, standing very still, like mannequins. The timestamp read 2 hours after I'd left the ridge. Leah wrote, "They were here for like an hour. Sat there. Didn't look around." She added a winky emoji to hide the spike in her own nerves. She sent the picture again when she texted me that night. They came around to ask questions. No badge. Took notes. Asked whether you'd been in touch with anyone about the sighting. I had told her nothing aside from the piece we were compiling. She had told me the lobby detail later. The men in the photograph wore black suits with thin ties and coats buttoned the same way. Their faces were blank in the low light, like something had been smudged from a photograph. I began to see the suits in other places that mattered less and therefore meant more. At the post office, 2 older men in trench coats lingered in the queue as if they were waiting for someone they expected to be late. At a gas station, a man in a black blazer slid his thumbs through his wallet and watched the pumps without buying gas. At the edge of a benefit event we covered, someone asked after the disappearance of a neighbor's drone and then, when I explained, didn't listen and went on to ask about local zoning laws. It was the kind of distraction people use when they don't want to talk. I woke in the middle of a week to a voicemail that made my mouth go dry. It was my own voice, reading the unedited transcript of an interview I had done with a retired air traffic controller, his exact cadence and his little way of saying "look," followed by a strip of static and the same flat male voice, "You saw nothing." The date stamp on the message said it had been left after midnight, hours after I'd gone to bed. I kept replaying it like it held a secret code. The static between the lines sounded deliberate, like someone using the airwaves to mask something else. I started to get followed in small, careful ways. Not shadowed in alleys, more like a presence you notice in the periphery. A black sedan I could never get a plate for would glide past me at stoplights and pull into the same garage I had to enter. Once, I saw a man in a suit at a newsstand across from a diner where I'd gone to write. He read a paper with the sports page open and didn't move for a long time. I told myself I was being neurotic. The deputy was helpful in the way people are when rules matter more than mysteries. He set up a log at dispatch for similar calls. He pulled footage from a handful of traffic cams. Some pieces were clear, a black sedan, make indistinct, plates that shifted in the feed like a bad edit. Sometimes there was nothing on the feed for stretches that matched times we saw someone. He told me they were running a check on stolen plates. He asked me to stay with a friend sometimes. I laughed when he suggested it, but took him seriously. I spent nights at Leah's place or Mark's, when the air in my throat gathered into an animal. A week after the tape, someone left a business card under my windshield wiper. A cheap card, thin paper. A small logo in the corner I couldn't place. On the back, a single sentence typed in block capitals: "Please consider not mentioning this." When I called the number, which was a burner, a woman answered and put someone on the call and the line went dead. The deputy wrote it in the report and the tech checked the number and came back with a shrug. "No hits," he said. Registered on a throwaway site. 3 days later, on a fog-thick morning, I drove to the ridge again because some parts of me still thought that going back would make the story make sense. I took my recorder and my camera and I wanted to prove the thing was there or prove it wasn't. The hikers were quiet at this time, like folks who had been told not to repeat certain things. A man I'd interviewed the first day tugged my sleeve and asked, "Did you see anyone at the lot when you left?" I said no, and he looked like he'd asked too much. On the ridge, someone waved at me from the tree line. It was the air traffic controller, the retired man with the dry laugh. He walked up and said, "You might want to be careful publishing details." I told him publishing is what I do. He said, "I get it." His hands were clean and his voice was small. He had the same look as the men in the photos, not in face but in the way he held himself, like someone who had been trained to stand and be unremarkable. That evening, as I drove away from the ridge, a car I didn't recognize pulled up in my rear view and followed. I took longer routes. I stopped at a diner and ordered food with the kind of methodical slowness that makes someone else in a booth assume you are waiting. The car sat at the curb with the engine off. 2 figures leaned forward slightly in the seats. They were not looking through the diners. They were looking at the street. When I left, it followed at a respectful distance until I hit the city limits, and then it dropped back, as if choosing which part of my life to watch. The tape put pressure on everything. It read like someone had a log of my life and could press play on some moments. The idea itself is what makes a person small. It's the sense that someone has been in your life and cataloged sentences that you considered for yourself. It breeds a tightness in the chest, as if you're trying not to breathe loud enough to call attention to yourself. 2 afternoons after I found the business card, I got a knock at the door of the newsroom. 2 men were in the lobby. Not photographers, not PR, suits black and thin ties, the same look the stills had caught. One of them asked for me like he had rehearsed my full name. He said, "We'd like a minute." The lobby was awkwardly quiet as I walked in. Their voices were steady and their faces almost kind of bland. They did not carry badges. They did not say who they worked for. One of them had a line of papers and he placed them on the reception desk in a tidy pile as if to make a point. The receptionist slid them across with the slow part of her smile, the part that means the receptionist is trying not to escalate something already too public. They were not rude. They were not threatening in ways I'd expect. Their method was different. It was clinical. "We'd like to know what you saw," the taller one said. I was blunt because that's how my job works. "You already know everything you need," I said. "You've been listening in." He did not smile. "We heard things," he said. "We listened. This has to be kept quiet." There was a long moment where polite people around us pretended not to eavesdrop. Mark came down the hall looking like he'd been called to a meeting with a dean he respected but disliked. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Walk with me." We made an excuse and left. When we were a hallway over, he said, "If they ask again, tell them you'll talk through channels." He meant the corporate channels that make everything official and therefore slower. I told him I would. I told him I had a tape. He said slow and careful words about evidence and lawyers. They didn't show a badge. They said they were collectors and observers. They said not to publish matters of national interest. Their voices were quiet and even. The way they spoke made it feel like a courtesy rather than a command. My neck prickled with the knowledge that whether or not I listened, someone had already been into my place and left me a recorder. I filed the story I had, cautious, factual, quoted authorities and the hikers and the deputy. I kept the part about the tape out of the first draft. Overnight, the newsroom had 10 messages from people who wanted to talk about strange lights and one person who wanted to ask whether reporters were going after someone in authority. Security cameras in town showed a black sedan circling on the nights we said it was there. One camera showed a car stop and two figures step out and stand like they were reading the sky. The text said the plate on the feed flickered between numbers like someone was editing the world to be messy. The sheriff called it anomalous footage, which is a word for we don't know. That night, I brought the cassette recorder home. I left it on the kitchen table and I slept at Leah's with the light on. I told her everything because you tell someone everything when someone else is cataloging your sentences. She said, "Get out of town," like most lovers of drama in small lives say at least once. I took the tape with me back to my place the next morning because I'm not great at hideouts. I put it under the floorboard in the closet like a man making a ridiculous plan and then decided there was no reason to hide it. The following day I came home early. The door again was unlocked. My gut twisted. I thought of the deputy, of the neat evidence bags, of a dozen small official rituals. Inside, nothing was missing, but the apartment felt rearranged. The living room rug was slightly bunched, the framed photos leaned the wrong way. On the dining table lay a single sheet of paper, a printout with one sentence underlined in black pen from the story I had filed 2 days earlier. The sentence was the lead. The paper had no other mark. On my desk, taped to the corner of my last field notebook, was another card. This one had a single line typed, "We're sorry for the trouble. Please stop asking." There was no signature. My hands were clumsy enough that the card slipped and fell to the floor, and I watched it as if I expected it to scuttle like an insect. When I reached to pick it up, I heard the door knock. Someone rapped 3 times, slow and polite. I did the reasonable thing. I did not open the door. I called the deputy. He said he'd be there in about 10 minutes. I peered through the peephole and saw 2 men standing with their shoulders squared and their hands folded. They were dressed like the pictures. One of them held a thin notebook in one hand like he might make notes on the weather. They did not look like they belonged in my hallway. They looked like they belonged everywhere. The shorter man said through the door, "We just need to ask a few questions." I felt something in me that didn't like being demanded in a soft voice. "We've talked," I said. "Leave a card. Send an email." "We prefer in person," he said. His voice had a small laugh at the end that didn't reach his eyes. They described things that should not have been public. They described my field recorder's model number. They described what I wore that morning to go to the ridge. They said my editor's name and the color of the mug he preferred. They even mentioned the exact sentence I'd almost posted on a forum about the thing being silent like a thought. I had typed that line and deleted it. They read it back like a fact. On the tape, the voice had said, "You saw nothing." In the doorframe, the shorter man repeated it as if reciting a weather report. He said, "Best to not." And then the deputy's footsteps in the hallway cut through the word. The deputy's flashlight made the men's faces raw. The men folded like people who had not expected the light and then smiled and left in the manner of people who had been doing something polite and necessary. The deputy said we'd file another report. He said we'd step up patrols in the area. He told me to go to his office and file it formally. He asked whether I wanted an escort. I said I didn't. I had the tape. I had a story. I had a little museum of small evidence. I still felt like a person with agency, like someone could still do the slow work of paperwork and make the bogus feel legitimate. For a few days the men did not appear. Then, the tape's voice came through another way, a printed envelope on my desk at work, folded tight. Inside a single index card, typed with 3 words in all caps, "N.O." I felt small when I read it, like the room had been rearranged and a single heavy object had been placed on my chest. A colleague in investigations came by and asked if I wanted her to look into it. She took the card and said little, the way people do who want to be useful without making things bigger. I stopped sleeping normally. My dreams shifted into procedural sequences. I would wake at the part when my hands found a pen. I would fall asleep at the part where I called the sheriff. I checked the locks and double-checked and then checked again. I moved the cassette, the spare cards, the printouts into a safe deposit box because idiots hide the important things in plain sight. I started to think in logs and procedures and little rituals the way people who want to be ready do. There was a last confrontation because there always is some finite point where a pattern has to break or become law. It happened on a rainy Tuesday. I had been out checking a report of another sighting, an odd cluster of lights over a ridge near the river. The deputy offered to come along. He did not. I had my camera and the small, stupid hope that it would all be explainable. The sky was low and steel and the trail was muddy and the hikers were tired. I took a call while I was climbing down. It was Leah. She said, "Don't go home yet. Don't go back alone." "I'll be fine," I said, because that is what men say when they don't want to be the small heartbeat of worry for people who care about them. When I arrived, my car's windshield had a single smear of paper stuck under the wiper. It was wet. I opened the door and found the cassette recorder on the passenger seat like a gift. The tape inside was already moving as if someone had just hit play. I sat down and listened. At first, nothing but my own breathing. Then the day's calls unfurled. My voice, tired and mud-breathing, asking who else had been up there. The deputy's voice, tired and clipped back. Then, after that, the male voice, not the soft-clipped "you saw nothing," but something close and surgical. "You will not publish this," it said. The tones on the tape were calm in a way that tempted you to nod. It admitted nothing, threatened nothing, merely informed. "The noise you heard," it said quietly, "was not for you." I filed all the evidence I had. I made copies of the tape, dated the duplicates, handed one to the deputy and left the original in the evidence locker. I had the byline on a piece the next week that said what I could say without risking more. I wrote facts and kept adjectives to a minimum. The story ran on a Tuesday and got the right attention for a small paper, a spike in hits, a note on the city show, a request to do a radio interview about unexplained aerial phenomena. People sent me messages with tabs about satellite launches and military exercises. People wrote me half prayers and half accusations. Someone suggested I had staged it for clicks. Someone sent a file with a photo of a similar object taken in another state. Late that night, I packed a bag. I gave the deputy a list of people I trusted and told him where I was going. He shook his head and said he couldn't grant witnesses safe houses. He said he'd keep the report active and would call if anything turned up. He asked whether I wanted his card. I took it like someone takes an umbrella when the weather is bad. I left my apartment at midnight with the tape recorder's duplicate in my pocket and a hard drive with everything on it zipped in my bag. I drove to my brother's house 3 states away and slept on a couch that smelled like old laundry and football. I stayed there a few days and then moved to a town with no mountain ridges in sight and bought, under a new name, a cheap room. I went through that small, bureaucratic process in a neat line because that is the kind of adult doing the thing you can call either cowardice or wisdom. Months passed. Word about the lights flattened into the muck of the internet. People wrote threads and theories. Someone dug through public flight logs and found nothing. The deputy called sometimes and left notes. The duplicates I made of the tape went to a lawyer I trusted and into an archive in case my reporter's friends needed evidence. The original stayed with the sheriff's office. I never stopped thinking about how they had known lines I had only half formed. I never stopped thinking about the calm voice telling me to stop. But the men in suits, the ones who asked, the ones who left cards and notes in the tape, they did not follow me across state lines. They did not knock on my brother's door. They sent only the one last envelope on a day I moved to a cheap room, and inside was a small typed note, "Forget this article for your own good." The deputy called when I told him, and he said he had no clue who had delivered it. He said he would log it. I sold the apartment. I changed my phone numbers twice. I cut down on late-night hikes. I kept the duplicates of the tape in 2 different banks and with a lawyer and in a cloud service under a name that could be traced only by subpoena. I kept moving in the way people do and want to be invisible in a crowd. I wrote other stories and won a small prize for a piece on neglected towns. The fear was not extinguished. It was corralled into small rituals, locks, backups, friends I called in the middle of the night. Years like this pile up like junk mail. You forget the intrusive things in the same way you forget a cold that was bad for a day and manageable the next. But I'd listen to the tape sometimes in safe rooms, in lawyer offices, in the presence of colleagues who had a taste for the weird. I'd play the line at the end and watch smart people's faces fold. "You saw nothing," I'd say, and they would read the recording and the way the line fell and make faces. Once, at a panel about investigative reporting, an older man in the audience, a retired intelligence reporter, leaned forward after my talk and said in a small, blunt voice, "You did right by the evidence you had. Don't publish what you don't have." He'd seen my story in the paper and knew the look on my face. He asked if I wanted to talk. We did, and he told me the obvious things. Agencies can be crude or sharp. People can be made to sign NDAs or told to stop in ways that look like advice. He told me to be careful with evidence, to keep copies, and to have a plan if anyone came with more than paper. I still keep the cassette tape duplicates in a safe box. I keep the logs. I keep the emails and the deputy's notes. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I am a journalist who keeps documents. Maybe the men were contractors. Maybe they were bored guys with suits and cash. Maybe they were something governmental. I don't know. The tape is methodical about not telling me. The last time I saw a black suit up close was at a conference where I was moderating. 2 men at the back of the room sat like bookends. One slipped a card to my assistant at the break with the words, "Please consider stopping." It looked like a repeat. I turned it over and laughed at myself for the way my stomach tensed and for the way the room's hot air fans hummed like a new kind of insect. My assistant tossed the card into a drawer I keep with useless things. I walked away from the conference and toward my car, which waited with a coat I'd forgotten in the back seat. I moved towns again, later, and I stopped thinking about the men every day. The tape's voice settles into the background like an old radio station you pick up sometimes. On certain nights, when the wind is wrong and a plane goes over low enough to make the windows hum, I will feel the old smallness in my chest and I will check the locks and the logs and the boxes and bank vaults. I will call a friend just to hear a voice that is not used to clinical instruction. In the end, I survived. I left the apartment when it felt wrong and kept copies of anything that mattered. I filed the story with what I could verify. I kept my evidence in multiple places. I did the basic things: tell people where I was going, keep records, have witnesses. The men who turned up in the lobby and in the parking lots and who left the tape and the notes did not take anything of mine that mattered. They took the right to feel secure in a small space. I wrested that back with paperwork and distance. Sometimes I wonder whether the calmed male voice on the tape was daring me to publish or asking me to agree to a simple lesson, that some things are watched, and the watchers prefer silence. Maybe he had the authority to make life harder if I made noise. Maybe he did not. I never had to find out, because running a story is not a duel. It's slow work, and you live another day to write the next line. When people ask me if I do it again, go up to the ridge, follow the noise, ask the deputy to check, I say yes. You do your job and you survive. You protect the things you can. You make copies of the things you can't. You keep good friends and you keep a lawyer you trust. You stop leaving doors unlocked. I kept the recorder's hiss in my head the way you might keep an old song. The voice saying you saw nothing remains one of those facts that is small and exact and cannot be undone. I folded it into the pile of other odd things that people reel off as life. Weird neighbors, a job that drains you, a friend who moved away. I moved on. I informed the deputy of everything I kept. I stored copies where they could be summoned if ever legal reason demanded them. I lived. Once, at night, I pressed play on a duplicate just to remind myself that I had been given a command and that I had not obeyed it out of fear. The tape crackled and my own voice spoke and the other voice said its small line and I listened and then I stopped it and put the recorder away and slept. Survival is not dramatic. Survival is the thing you do after the knocking on the door, after the tape, after the card on the windshield. It's moving, safe by small steps, saving evidence, telling someone who can testify, leaving town when you have to. Survival was closing the door behind me and driving away so I could breathe again. That is what I did. I left and I kept breathing, and the recorder stayed in a locked file, spinning with the quiet memory of a thing said very calmly, "You saw nothing."